Bedtime Reading. The Secret Garden. Chapter 1. The Child Who Was Left Behind. When Mary Lennox left India to live in England, no one was sad to see her go. She was the most terrible little girl they knew. Mary was not pretty, and she was not nice either. She was very thin. She had thin yellow hair, and her face always had a mean, angry expression. Her parents were very busy people. They did not pay attention to Mary. Mary's father worked for the English government in India. Her mother was very beautiful and went to lots of parties. Mary's parents had not wanted a child. When Mary was born, they gave the baby to an Indian Ayi. They told the Ayi to keep her out of their sight. As Mary grew up, she spent all her time with the Ayi and the other servants. These people let Mary do whatever she wanted, and they gave her everything she wanted. This was because they knew that if Mary cried, she would disturb her parents. Then her parents would become angry with the servants. So Mary became a very selfish, angry, and lonely girl. She did not have any friends. All the teachers who came to teach Mary how to read and write left because Mary did not behave well. Fortunately, she was intelligent, so she learned how to read and write anyway. However, in a few short days, Mary's life was changed. She woke up one morning to discover that her parents had died in the night of a terrible disease called cholera. Many of the servants had died too. An officer came to the house to search for survivors and found Mary there, alone. For some reason, the child hadn't become ill. Mary had liked to look at her mother because she was so young and pretty, but Mary had not known her mother or her father, so she did not feel very sad that they were dead. Mary was a very selfish child, and she only thought about herself. She wondered who would take care of her now. She hoped that they would be polite to her. She wanted them to give her whatever she wanted, like her Ayi had. Mary was taken to the house of an Englishman named Mr. Crawford. She was going to stay there for a while. Mary did not like the man's family. He had 5 children. At first, the children tried to be nice to Mary. However, she was so unkind to them that no one would play with her. They called her names, which made her very angry. Basil, the little boy, called her Mistress Mary quite contrary. After Mary had been there for 2 weeks, Basil said to Mary,
"I heard that you're going home at the end of the week. I'm glad. I don't like you."
"I'm glad too, and I don't like you either," said Mary. "Where is home?"
"You're going to your uncle's house in England,"
said Basil.
"I heard my parents talking about it. You'll be very unhappy there. Your uncle's a hunchback."
"What's a hunchback?" said Mary.
"It's a man who has a large hump on his back, just like a camel. Your uncle's a horrible monster,"
said Basil.
"He lives in a large house in the country. No one ever goes there. He won't let them because he hates people."
"Go away, I don't believe you," said Mary. She put her fingers in her ears. But Mary thought about what Basil had told her. When Mrs. Crawford told Mary that she was going to live in England with her uncle, Archibald Craven, Mary said nothing. She looked as if she didn't care. Basil's parents did not know what to think of this strange child.
A few days later, Mary got on a large boat and traveled to England. She traveled with an Englishwoman.
The woman was very busy with her own children and didn't pay much attention to her. When the boat reached London, a woman named Mrs. Medlock was waiting for Mary. Mrs. Medlock was Archibald Craven's housekeeper. She was strong and fat-looking. She had gray hair, red cheeks, and large black eyes. She did not think well of Mary. "She's rather ugly, isn't she?" Mrs. Medlock said to the Englishwoman. "We heard her mother was beautiful." The child did not receive her mother's looks. "Oh, I think she'll be prettier when she's older," said the other woman kindly. "She's just very thin. The weather in India is not good for young children." "Well, there's nothing for children at Misselthwaite Manor," said Mrs. Medlock. Misselthwaite Manor was Mr. Archibald Craven's house. The women thought Mary was not listening, but she was. She was looking at all the sights and sounds of London. She wondered what her uncle would be like. Was he really a hunchback? She had never seen a hunchback. Maybe India didn't have them. Since she had been living with the Crawfords, Mary had felt lonely. She thought about the Crawford children. They seemed to belong with their parents, who loved them. She felt that her parents hadn't loved her. None of the servants had loved her either. She did not know that this was because she was an unpleasant child. No one had ever taught her to be kind. Mary did not even know that she was unpleasant. She often thought that others were unpleasant, but she did not know that she was unpleasant herself. The next day, Mary and Mrs. Medlock began the journey to Yorkshire, where Misselthwaite Manor was. Mary sat in the train and did not speak. Mrs. Medlock looked at Mary's face. It looked very sour, just like a lemon. She thought, "I've never seen an unhappier child in my life." Mrs. Medlock did not really like children, but she decided to tell Mary about her new home anyway. "Did your parents ever tell you about your uncle?" she asked Mary. "No," said Mary. "Well, you are going to a very strange place. Misselthwaite Manor is over 600 years old. The house has more than 100 rooms, but most of them are locked. The house is on the edge of the moor. The moor is a large, flat land with grass and hills. The house has many gardens, but there's nothing else," she said. Mary tried to pretend that she didn't care. The woman looked at her curiously. "You're like an old woman, not a child," she said. "Don't you care?" "It doesn't matter whether I care or not," said Mary.
"You're right," said Mrs. Medlock. "You have to live at Misselthwaite whether you like it or not. It's the easiest thing. Your uncle isn't going to see you. He doesn't see anyone. Oh, yes, I forgot something. Your uncle has a bad back. It made him an angry person. Even though he had lots of money and a large house, he was a sour young man. He didn't become happy until he met his wife."
Mary was curious now. She didn't think a hunchback would be married. Mrs. Medlock saw that Mary was listening, so she continued her story. Mr. Craven's wife was a sweet, pretty woman. She loved nature and she loved gardens and flowers. Mr. Craven would have done anything for her. No one thought she would marry a man like him. People thought she married him for his money. But she didn't, said Mrs. Medlock firmly. When she died... "Oh, did she die?" cried Mary. She thought of a children's story she had read once.
The story was about a beautiful princess and an ugly man. She suddenly felt sorry for her uncle.
"Yes, she died," said Mrs. Medlock. "Then Mr. Craven became stranger than ever. He won't let anyone see him. He hates people. He won't leave his rooms. He only has one old servant to care for him." Mary thought it sounded like something in a fairy tale. A dark old house with 100 rooms. A mysterious hunchback with a sad story. She stared out the window at the rain. England had very gray skies. It rained a lot. In India, it had always been hot and sunny.
Don't think that you'll see your uncle. You won't. He doesn't want to see you, says Mrs. Medlock. There aren't any other children at the house either. You'll have to play and take care of yourself. I will show you what rooms you can enter. There are many rooms you must stay away from. There are gardens outside for you to play in. But when you're in the house, you cannot wander around. This is very important. Mr. Craven won't allow it.
I don't want to see his horrible house, said sour little Mary. She stared out the window. She didn't feel sorry for Mr. Craven any more. He probably deserved all the bad things that happened to him. She turned towards the window and stared at the rain. She stared at it for so long that she fell asleep. Chapter 2. Across the Moors. When Mary woke up, she was hungry. Luckily, Mrs. Medlock had a basket of food with her. They had some cold chicken, bread and butter, and some hot tea. Afterwards, Mrs. Medlock fell asleep. Mary stared at the window at the rain. Would it ever stop? She wished she had a book to read. Finally, she fell asleep again. Mrs. Medlock woke her up. It was nighttime. "It's time to get off the train," she said. "We're at Thwaite Station. We've still got a long way to travel before we reach Misselthwaite Manor." They found their carriage. The carriage driver and Mrs. Medlock knew each other a little.
"I see you've returned,"
said the driver to Mrs. Medlock.
"And you've brought the child with you."
"Yes, that's her," said Mrs. Medlock. "How's your wife?"
"She's all right. Well, let's go."
Mary and Mrs. Medlock got into the carriage. Mary stared out the window into the darkness. She wished she could see the countryside. She wasn't an easily frightened child, but she couldn't help wondering what was going to happen. "What does the moor look like? I want to see it," said Mary to Mrs. Medlock. "Look out the window in about 10 minutes. You'll see it then," said Mrs. Medlock. "You won't see much because it's dark, but you'll see something." When Mary looked outside, she saw a large open space. There was long grass and hills. The grass moved in the wind. There were no trees or bushes. The wind made a strange sound as it moved through the grass. "Now we're on the moors," said Mrs. Medlock. "The moor is many miles of wild grassland. No trees or bushes grow here. Nothing lives on it but wild ponies and sheep." Mary frowned. "It's not the ocean, is it?" she asked. "The wind makes a strange sound in the grass. It sounds just like water. I don't like it," she said. "I don't like it either," said Mrs. Medlock. "But in spring, I suppose it's nice enough. Plenty of people love the moors." Finally, after about 2 hours, they arrived at Misselthwaite Manor. It was a very large, long house. There were very large oak trees all around it. Pitcher, Mr. Craven's servant, met them at the door. Mary and Mrs. Medlock had a cup of tea in the kitchen. When they had finished, Pitcher said,
"Mrs. Medlock, take the child to her room now. Mr. Craven is going to London in the morning. He doesn't want to see her."
"All right, Mr. Pitcher," said Mrs. Medlock. "As long as I know what's expected of me, I'll be all right."
"Just make sure he's not disturbed,"
said Pitcher.
"Make sure he doesn't see what he doesn't want to see."
So in this strange way, Mary Lennox came to live at Misselthwaite Manor. She had never felt so unpleasant in all her life. Chapter 3. Meeting Martha. When Mary woke up, the sun was shining. She looked around her room. It had a lot of nice furniture, but it wasn't very cheerful. It was more like an adult's room than a child's. She was surprised to see a young woman in her room who was making a fire in the fireplace. She wore a maid's uniform. Mary looked out the window at the grasslands. The grass was dry and brown because it was winter. There were no trees or bushes growing on it.
All Mary could see was brown, dry grass, going on for miles and miles.
"How do you do? I'm Martha. Do you like our moor?" asked the maid suddenly in a cheerful voice. "No, I hate it," said Mary. "That's because you're not used to it," said Martha. "It's not very pretty now, but in spring it will be beautiful." "So you like the moor?" asked Mary. "Oh, yes. In spring the grass is green and the birds are singing. The fields are full of flowers and the air smells sweet. I wouldn't live away from the moors, not if you paid me." Mary listened to Martha talk. She thought this servant was very strange. In India, the servants never talked to their masters like that, as if the masters were their friends. Indian servants only spoke when spoken to. They were always quiet and obedient. Mary had always hit her ayi in the face when she was angry. Mary looked at this young Englishwoman. She wondered what Martha would do if Mary hit her. Probably she would hit her back. "You are a strange servant," Mary said. Martha didn't seem upset by this comment. She just laughed. "I know it," she said. "If Mr. Craven had a wife, I could never work here. I'm too plain, and I don't speak like an educated lady. But this is a strange house, even though it seems so fancy. Mrs. Medlock gave me a job here because she's a friend of my family. She said I couldn't work here if this house was like other rich people's houses."
"Are you going to be my servant?" asked Mary. "I'm Mrs. Medlock's servant," said Martha firmly. "Just like she's Mr. Craven's servant. But I'll clean your room a little and help you. But you won't need much. You can take care of yourself."
Mary didn't understand what Martha was talking about. "What do you mean? Who's going to dress me?" Martha stared at her. "What? Can't you dress yourself?" "No, I never dressed myself in my life. My ayi always dressed me," said Mary. She didn't like this servant.
"Well," said Martha, "it's time for you to learn. It will be good for you to take care of yourself. I think it's amazing that rich people's children don't grow up to be very stupid. They can't do anything for themselves. Their nurses are always dressing and washing them, just like dolls."
"It's different in India," said Mary coldly. "I'm sure it is," said Martha. She didn't seem to know that servants weren't supposed to talk this way. "It's because there are so many black people in India instead of nice, normal, white people. When I heard you were coming from India, I thought you were black too." Now Mary was really angry. "What?" she shouted. "You thought I was a black person? How dare you? You daughter of a pig!" Instead of looking sorry, however, Martha just looked angry. "Who are you calling names?" she said. "A young lady shouldn't talk that way. I've always thought black people must be very nice. I heard that they are very religious. I was hoping to see one. When I came into your room this morning, I walked over to your bed to see you. And there you were. You're not any blacker than I am. You're just very yellow," Martha said. She seemed disappointed that Mary wasn't an Indian. Mary had never been so angry or embarrassed. "I can't believe you thought I was a native Indian. You know nothing about India. The natives aren't people. They're servants who have to do whatever white people want. You don't know anything," she shouted. Suddenly, she was feeling confused and alone. She did not understand this strange new country or its customs. She felt terribly lonely, and everyone she knew was dead. She began to cry. Martha looked upset. There, don't cry," she said. "I didn't know you'd be angry." "You're right. I don't know anything. You mustn't cry, Miss Mary," she said gently. Soon Mary stopped crying. She felt a little better. Martha looked very relieved. "Now it's time for you to get up. Mrs. Medlock told me to bring you your meals into the room next to this. I'll help you with your clothes," she said.
Martha helped Mary get dressed. Martha thought to herself that she had never seen a child like Mary. Mary just stood and waited for Martha to put her clothes on. It was as if she didn't have hands or feet.
"Why don't you put on your shoes?" asked Martha. "My ayi did it," said Mary. It was the custom. If Martha had been a well-trained maid for a rich lady, then things would have been different. Martha would have been quiet and obedient to Mary. But Martha was only a poor Yorkshire girl who had many small brothers and sisters. These children always dressed and fed themselves. So it is understandable that Martha thought Mary was a very strange girl. As for Mary, she had never known a servant who talked as much as Martha. In India, the servants were always quiet. At first, Mary was not interested in Martha's talk, but soon she began to listen. Martha was talking about her family. "Oh, you should see them all," she said. "There are 12 of us, and my father has a hard time making money. It's hard for Mother to find food for everyone. But the children just run and play outside. Mother says the fresh air fattens them up. Perhaps they eat the grass, just like our Dickens pony." "Where did he get the pony?" asked Mary.
"He found it when it was a baby. It was alone on the moor. Its mother had died. Dickon began to make friends with it. He found it grass to eat. Now the pony lets him ride on his back. Dickon is a kind boy, and animals like him."
Mary had never had an animal of her own. She had always thought she might like one. She began to feel a little interested in Dickon. This was important, because Mary had never been interested in anyone but herself.
When Mary went into the little sitting room next to the bedroom, she saw that a breakfast was laid out for her. But Mary had always had a very small appetite. She looked at the food without interest.
"I don't want it," she said. "What?" said Martha. "You don't want your breakfast?" "No. You don't know how good it is," said Martha. "I don't want it," repeated Mary. Said Martha. "I can't stand to see good food be wasted. I wish my brothers and sisters were here. They would eat everything in 2 minutes." "Why?" asked Mary. "Why? Because they've never had a full stomach in their lives. They're always hungry," said Martha. "I don't know what it means to be hungry," said Mary. "Well, it would be good for you to learn," said Martha. "I don't understand people who just stare at good bread and meat. Don't I wish Dickon and Phil and Jane had what's on this table?" "Why don't you take it to them?" asked Mary. "It's not mine," said Martha firmly. Mary drank some tea and ate a little toast. When she had finished, Martha said, "Well, there's nothing for you to do in the house. You should go outside and play." "Who will go with me?" Mary asked. "You'll go by yourself," Martha said. "You'll have to play alone, just like my brothers and sisters do. Our Dickon goes off alone by himself and plays for hours. That's how he met his pony. There are wild sheep that know him too. Even if there's a little to eat, Dickon always saves a bit of bread to give to his pets. The mention of Dickon and his animals made Mary decide to go out. She wanted to see if the birds of England were different from those in India. "If you walk around the outside of the house, you'll find the gardens," said Martha. "There are lots of flowers in the summer, but there's nothing growing now," she said. Then she thought for a moment. "One of the gardens is locked up," she said. "There's a wall around it, just like the other gardens, but there's no door to this garden. No one has been inside it for 10 years. Mary turned and looked at Martha. This was something interesting. "Why?" she asked. "It was Mr. Craven's wife's garden. She loved it. When she died, Mr. Craven had the garden shut up. He dug a hole and buried the key. Oh, I hear Mrs. Medlock's bell ringing. I must go." Martha hurried away. Chapter 4. The Robin and the Gardener. So Mary put on her coat and went outside. The skies were gray, and it was cold. She could not help thinking about the mysterious locked garden that no one had seen for 10 years. She wondered what it looked like, and if there were flowers in it. Why was the door to the garden locked? You could always walk into a garden. Mary saw that she was near some gardens and headed towards them. Maybe the locked garden was nearby. Mary walked through several gardens. They had trees and paths and fountains. Everything was brown and looked dead because it was winter. Soon Mary saw a wall with vines growing on it. Was this the wall of the locked garden? No, there was a green door in the wall, and it was open. Mary walked through the door. She saw an old man in the garden, which had fruit trees. He had some gardening tools with him. He seemed surprised to see Mary, but nodded his head in a greeting. He had a cross-looking face and did not seem very happy to see another person. "What is this place?" asked Mary.
"It's one of the kitchen gardens,"
said the old man. Mary saw that there was another green door in an opposite wall. "Where does that door lead to?" she asked.
"Another one of the kitchen gardens."
"Can I look into it?"
"If you like, but there's nothing to see,"
said the man. Mary went into the second green door. This garden had walls around it also. There were winter vegetables growing out of the ground, such as potatoes and carrots. Mary saw another green door. She hoped the door would not open, because that would mean she had found the mysterious garden. But the door opened immediately. Mary went into the third walled garden, which was an orchard with many fruit trees. She looked around for another door. There was none. Mary looked at one corner of the orchard's wall. She saw the tops of the trees on the other side of the wall. It was as if there was another garden on the other side. Was it the mysterious garden? What was on the other side of the wall? Where was the door? Suddenly, Mary heard the sweet sound of a bird singing. The bird was sitting on the treetops, in the area on the other side of the orchard. It was almost as if he had seen Mary and was calling to her. The bird had a little brown body and a bright red chest. His song was pretty. Mary listened to him sing, and his cheerful song gave her a nice feeling. Even a sour, unpleasant little girl can be lonely. The strange walled gardens, the quiet house, the wide grasslands made Mary feel as if there was no one in the world but herself. The bird's happy little song brought a look to Mary's face. It was almost a smile. Soon the bird flew away. Perhaps he lives in the mysterious garden and knows all about it, Mary thought. Mary walked back through the green doors to the first kitchen garden. where the old man was working. She stood watching him, in her strange, unfriendly way. "I have been into the other gardens," she said.
"There was nothing to stop you,"
said the man. "I went into the orchard."
"Well, there was no dog at the door to bite you, was there?"
said the man. He didn't seem to want to talk. "In the orchard, there was no door to the other garden," said Mary.
"What garden?"
said the man in a louder voice. He looked uncomfortable. "The one on the other side of the orchard wall," said Mary. "There are trees there. I saw their tops. There was a bird sitting in one of the trees, and he sang. He had a red chest." To Mary's surprise, the man suddenly smiled. The smile changed his cross, angry old face. It made Mary think how much nicer a person looked when he smiled. This was a new thought for her. The man turned around and whistled. It was a soft, low sound. The next moment, a wonderful thing happened. The little brown and red bird flew through the air and landed in the dirt near the gardener's foot.
"Here he is,"
said the old man. Then he spoke to the bird as if he were speaking to a child.
"Where have you been, you little beggar? I haven't seen you before today. Have you been searching for a wife this early in the year? You're too bold."
The little bird looked at the old man with his bright black eyes. He hopped around, searching for seeds and insects in the dirt. He didn't seem to be afraid of them at all. It gave Mary a strange feeling in her heart to look at him. The bird was so pretty and cheerful and seemed like a person. He had a little fat body and thin, delicate legs. "Does he always come when you call him?" asked Mary.
"Yes, I've known him ever since he was little. He came out of the nest in the other garden. He first flew over the wall, but he was too small and weak to fly back for the next few days. So we became friends. Then when he flew back, all his family had gone. He was lonely and came back to me."
"What kind of bird is he?" asked Mary.
"Don't you know? He's a robin, redbreast. They're the friendliest birds in the world. They're almost as friendly as dogs, if you know how to treat them. Watch him hopping in the dirt and looking at us. He knows we're talking about him."
It was a very strange thing to see the old man and the robin redbreast. The man looked at the bird as if he was proud of him.
"He's a vain one,"
said the man, smiling.
"He likes to hear us talk about him. And he's curious. He's always coming to see what I'm planting. That bird knows a lot of things. Things Mr. Craven doesn't bother to discover. He's the real head gardener, he is."
Mary watched the robin hop around. It seemed that his bright black eyes looked at her curiously. Mary wondered what he was thinking. The strange feeling in her heart became stronger. "Where did the rest of the robins go?" she asked.
"I don't know, but this one stayed. He knew he'd be lonely without a friend."
Mary stepped a little closer to the robin. She looked at the bird closely. She realized something. "I'm lonely," she said. Mary had not known until now that loneliness was what made her feel angry and cross her whole life. She didn't discover this important fact until she met the old man and the robin. The old man looked carefully at Mary.
"Are you the little girl from India?"
he asked. Mary nodded her head.
"Then it's no surprise you're lonely. This is a lonely place,"
he said. He began to dig again, while the little robin hopped around, looking busy and happy. "What is your name?" Mary asked the old man.
"Ben Weatherstaff,"
he said. He laughed a little.
I'm lonely myself, except when the robin is with me. He's the only friend I've got.
I have no friends at all, said Mary. I've never had any. In India, my ayi didn't like me, and I never played with anyone. People never like me, and I never like people. It's the custom of the Yorkshire people of England to say exactly what they think. Ben Weatherstaff was a Yorkshire man.
You and me are a lot alike,
he said.
We're not good looking, and we're both as sour and angry as we look. We've got the same nasty tempers, I think.
This was a fact, and Mary had never heard the truth about herself. In India, the servants always agreed with and obeyed you, whatever you did. Mary had never thought much about her looks, but she wondered if she was as unattractive as Ben Weatherstaff said. She wondered if she really was nasty. She began to feel uncomfortable. Suddenly, the robin flew up to the top of a wall. He sang a little song. Ben Weatherstaff laughed.
He wants to be friends with you,
he said.
I think he likes you.
He likes me? Said Mary. She looked up at the robin. Would you make friends with me? She said. Her voice was not hard. It was soft and eager as a little girl's can be. Ben Weatherstaff looked at her in surprise.
Why,
You said that as nicely
as if you were a real child, instead of a sharp old woman. You said it almost like Dickon talks to his wild animal friends.
Mary turned around quickly. Do you know Dickon too? She asked.
Everyone knows Dickon. He's a good boy. One of the best. He's always wandering around the moor. The animals trust him.
Mary wanted to ask old Ben more about Dickon, but just then the robin flew away. He had visited them for a while, but now he had other things to do. He's flying back over the orchard, into the garden that has no door, cried Mary, watching the bird.
He lives there,
said Ben Weatherstaff.
He's making his nest there. He's probably making friends with some little girl robin who lives in the old rose trees.
Are there rose trees there? Asked Mary.
There used to be, 10 years ago,
said Ben. He looked uncomfortable again. I want to see them, said Mary. Where's the green door to that garden? It must be there somewhere.
There was a door 10 years ago, but there isn't now,
Ben said firmly. He looked as unfriendly as he had when she first met him. But there must be a door, cried Mary.
There's no door that anyone can find, and it's none of your business,
he said.
Don't be a troublesome child, prying into the affairs of others. I must go on with my work. Go away and play somewhere. I have no more time.
Ben Weatherstaff picked up his tools and walked away. He did not say goodbye. Chapter 5. The Strange Cry.
At first, each day at Misselthwaite Manor was exactly the same.
Mary woke up each morning and ate her breakfast in front of the fire with Martha. She stared out of the window at the wide brown moor. Finally, she would realize that if she didn't go outside, she would have to stay in and do nothing. So she went out. She did not know that this was the best thing for her. When she began to walk or run around the gardens and paths, she was making herself stronger. The wind, which was very cold, fresh, and strong, put color in her cheeks and brightened her eyes. Mary hated the wind, and she ran only to make herself warmer. But she was becoming a little healthier just by staying outside. After a few days of being outside all day, Mary woke up in the morning feeling really hungry for the first time. When she sat down to her breakfast, she ate all of it. "You liked that this morning, didn't you?" said Martha with surprise. "It tastes nice today," said Mary. She felt a little surprised herself. "It's the fresh air that's giving you an appetite. You're lucky you have food now that you're hungry. There's 12 children in our house who are hungry, but don't have much food. Keep on playing outside every day. You'll gain some weight and you won't be so thin and yellow." "I don't play," said Mary. "I have no toys to play with." "Of course you do," said Martha. "Our children play with sticks and stones. They just run around and shout and look at things." Mary didn't run and shout, but she looked at things. She walked around the gardens and the other places on the property. Sometimes she looked for Ben Weatherstaff, but he was often busy with his gardening work. Either that, or he was just too cross. There was one place Mary went to more often than any other. It was a path outside the walled gardens. There were thick vines on the walls. Mary noticed that in one area, the vines were especially thick, as if no one had cut them for a long time. A few days after she talked to Ben Weatherstaff, Mary had noticed this. She wondered why it was. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a bird. She looked up. The robin was sitting on top of the wall, looking at her. "Oh!" she cried. "Is it you? Is it you?" It seemed that he really understood her. The robin hopped along the wall and sang, as if he were talking to her. Mary began to laugh and run along the wall next to the little bird. As she ran and laughed, she looked almost pretty. "I like you! I like you!" she cried. She tried to whistle and sing like the robin. She didn't really know how to sing like a bird, but the robin didn't seem to mind. He sang back to her. Suddenly, the robin flew up to a tree behind one of the walls. Mary realized it was the same tree she had seen the day she met Ben Weatherstaff. It was the tree behind the mysterious wall. "That tree is in the garden that no one can enter," Mary said. "The robin lives in the garden without a door. I wish I could go inside and see it." For a moment, Mary watched the robin sitting in the tree. Then she ran all around the walls.
She ran through the orchard gardens and felt along the walls looking for a door, but she couldn't find one. "It really seems as if there is no door," said Mary out loud. "But there was a door 10 years ago, because Martha said that Mr. Craven threw away the key."
The mystery of the garden gave Mary something to think about. She began to feel glad that she had come to Misselthwaite Manor. In India, she had always been too hot and bored to care about things, but now that she was outside in the fresh, cold air, her mind and body felt a little better. Mary stayed outside all day. When she went inside, she felt hungry and tired, but good. She sat down to eat dinner and ate everything on her plate. She did not feel angry when Martha talked to her. Mary felt it was nice to hear her talk. "Why did Mr. Craven hate the garden?" Mary asked her. She had finished her dinner and was sitting by the fireplace. Martha smiled. "Are you still thinking about that garden?" she asked. "I knew you would. I was the same way when I first arrived here." She sat down and made herself comfortable. "Now listen," Martha said. "Mrs. Medlock said that we cannot talk about it. There are a lot of secrets in this house. Lots of things we can't talk about. That's Mr. Craven's orders. He doesn't want servants talking about his problems. The truth is that Mr. Craven wouldn't be like he is today if it wasn't for that garden. The garden was Mrs. Craven's. She had the garden made, and she loved it. She and Mr. Craven used to go into the garden, shut the door, and not come out for hours. Well, in the garden there was a rose tree with a branch that looked just like a chair. Mrs. Craven liked to sit in this tree and read. One day, she was sitting there and the branch broke and she fell. She was hurt very badly, and the next day she died. The doctors thought Mr. Craven would go crazy and die too. His wife was the only person he had ever loved. That's why he hates the garden. He shut the door and locked it. Then he threw away the key. Mary didn't ask any more questions. At that moment, a good thing was happening to her. She was thinking about this sad story, and she realized that she did feel sorry for her uncle. He hadn't had a very happy life. The wind was very loud, but suddenly Mary thought that she heard something else besides the wind. It sounded just like a child crying. Mary knew that sometimes the wind made a sound like someone crying, but as she listened to the sound, she felt sure that it came from inside the house, not outside. "Do you hear anyone crying?" Mary asked Martha. Martha looked uncomfortable. "It's just the wind," she said. "The wind makes that sound. It's nothing." Someone must have left a window open in the house. But at that moment, the door to Mary's sitting room opened with a loud noise. Mary could hear the crying quite loudly now. It sounded just like a child. "There! Don't you hear it?" she said.
Martha ran to close the door.
"It was the wind," she said. "Or maybe it's Betty, one of the maids. She had a toothache all day." She didn't look at Mary. Mary stared at Martha. She did not believe that she was telling the truth. Chapter 6. There was someone crying. The next morning it was raining very hard. Mary saw that she wouldn't be able to go outside that day. "What does your family do when it rains?" she asked Martha. "We try not to step on each other, mostly," said Martha. "Our house is so small, and there are 14 of us there. The biggest ones go and play in the cowshed. Dickon says he doesn't mind the rain. He goes outside no matter what the weather. He says he sees things in rainy weather. Once he found a little baby fox. Its mother had been killed, so Dickon brought it home. Another time he found a little crow, almost drowned. He brought it home and tamed it. Now it flies around with him everywhere." Mary had decided that she liked Martha's stories. In India, Mary's Ayi had told her stories about princesses and princes, or magical things. Martha's stories were more like real life. Mary especially liked it when Martha talked about her mother and Dickon. "Well, if I had an animal friend, I could play with it," said Mary. "But I have nothing." "Can you sew?" asked Martha. "No." "Can you read?" "Yes," said Mary. She liked reading. "Well, why don't you ask Mrs. Medlock if you can go into the library? There are thousands of books there." This was a very good idea. Mary didn't ask Mrs. Medlock, however. She knew that Mrs. Medlock was always in her comfortable sitting room downstairs. Really, in this house, one never saw anyone at all. Mary decided to go and find the library herself. She could explore the house. Mary waited until Martha had gone downstairs before leaving her room. For the next 2 hours, Mary wandered around the enormous house. It seemed that there really were 100 rooms. It was such a strange house. No one lived in these many rooms. In one room, there was a little glass cabinet. It had some small elephants inside. They were made of stone. These reminded Mary of India. She opened the cabinet and played with the little stone elephants for a while. Soon she began to feel tired. She put the ivory elephants back into the cabinet, the way she had found them. She decided it was time to go back to her room. She never had found the library. Unfortunately, Mary didn't remember the way back. She walked through a few halls with many doors and went up and down stairs. Most of the doors were locked. "I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere," she thought. It was so quiet. Mary came to the end of a passage. There was a beautiful thick curtain covering hanging on the wall at the passage's end. Now where do I go? Thought Mary. It was just at this moment that she heard a sound like someone crying. Curious, she put her hand on the curtain, and it moved. Mary was surprised to see that the curtain covered a door, which had opened. The passage continued on the other side. Mary saw Mrs. Medlock walk towards her with some keys in her hand. Suddenly, she saw Mary. "What are you doing here?" she said to Mary angrily. "What did I tell you about wandering around the house?"
"I was going back to my room, but I got lost," said Mary. "Then I heard someone crying."
Mrs. Medlock looked even angrier. "You didn't hear anyone crying," she said. She pulled and pushed Mary down the hall, around the corner, and back to her own room.
"Now you stay where you're told to stay. Otherwise you'll be locked up. Master Craven had better find you a teacher. You need someone to watch you. I have enough to do already."
Mary hated Mrs. Medlock at this moment. She did not cry. She was only very angry. She went and sat down by the fire. "There was someone crying. There was. Mary said to herself. "She is not telling the truth." She had heard the mysterious crying 2 times now. One day, she would find out what it was. In the meantime, she had had a very interesting day. Chapter 7. The Key to the Garden. 2 days after this, the rain ended. Mary woke up and could not believe what she saw. The sky was the most beautiful blue. Mary had never known that skies could be so blue. In India, the skies were always hot and yellow, but this sky was a deep, cool, wonderful blue, like a jewel. There were tiny white clouds in the air. "It's beautiful!" cried Mary. She jumped out of bed. "Yes, it's nice at this time of year," said Martha cheerfully. "The blue sky reminds us that spring is coming. It's still a long way off, but it's coming." "I thought it always rained and looked dark in England," said Mary. Martha laughed.
"Oh, no! Yorkshire is the most beautiful place on earth when the sun shines. Wait till you see the purple and yellow flowers growing, and smell the young grass. You'll want to stay out on the moor forever, just like Dickon does."
"Could I ever get there?" asked Mary. She stared out at the moor. It seemed to go on forever. "I don't know," said Martha. "I don't think you've ever used your legs in your life. I don't think you could walk 5 miles. It's 5 miles to my family's house." "I would like to see your house," said Mary. Martha stared at Mary for a moment. Then she went on with her cleaning. She thought that Mary's face did not look as sour as usual. It looked like her youngest sister's face when she wanted something very much. "I'll ask my mother," Martha said. "She almost always finds a way to do things. It's my day off today."
"And I'm going home."
"Oh, I'm glad. Maybe Mother can ask Mrs. Medlock about it. Mrs. Medlock likes my mother." "I like your mother, too," said Mary. "It seems like you do," said Martha. "And I haven't even met her. I like Dickon, too," said Mary. "Well, it's hard not to like Dickon. All the animals like him. I wonder what he would think of you," she said curiously, looking at Mary. "He wouldn't like me," said Mary in her cold little way. "No one does." Martha looked as if she was thinking about something.
"How do you like yourself?" she finally asked.
Mary was surprised. She thought about it for a minute. "I guess I don't really like myself," she said. "But I never thought of it before." Martha laughed. "That's something Mother once asked me. I've never forgotten it." Martha left as soon as she had given Mary breakfast. She was going to walk 5 miles to her family's little house. There she would help her mother with the washing. She would bake bread and enjoy herself very much. After breakfast, Mary went outside. She felt a little lonely knowing Martha wasn't going to be there when she returned. She went into the gardens as quickly as she could. The first thing she did was run around in circles 10 times. This made her feel better. After a minute, she went into one of the kitchen gardens. She saw Ben Weatherstaff, the old gardener, working there. The fresh air and blue sky seemed to make him feel good. He spoke to her.
"Spring is coming,"
he said.
"Can you smell it in the air?"
Mary breathed deeply. "I smelled something fresh and good," she said.
"That's the smell of the good earth, getting ready to grow things. If you look into the gardens, you'll see small plants beginning to grow."
"What are they?" asked Mary.
They're different kinds of flowers, crocuses and daffodils. Haven't you ever seen them before?
asked Ben. "In India, we don't have flowers like that, and it's always hot and wet and green. After it rains, things will grow very quickly."
Well, they don't do that here. But you watch. They'll get a little bigger each day,
said Ben. "Are there also flowers growing in the garden where the robin lives?" Mary asked. Ben didn't seem to like this question.
"Ask the robin,"
he said.
"He's the only one that knows. No one has been inside that garden for 10 years.
Mary walked away, thinking. She liked the mysterious garden, even though she'd never been inside it. She liked the robin, too. Also, she liked Martha, and she even liked Dickon and Martha's mother, even though she'd never met them. This seemed like a lot of people to like, when you'd never had friends before. Suddenly, Mary heard a bird singing. She looked at the ground, and there was the little robin. He was eating worms and seeds that had fallen on the ground and pretending not to notice her. But Mary knew he had been following her. "You do remember me," Mary cried. "Oh, you are prettier than anything in the world." The robin sang and hopped along the ground. Mary laughed and talked back to him. The robin looked like a little person with his tiny bright red chest and his bright eyes. He was beautiful. Mary forgot she had ever been angry or unhappy in her life. As Mary stood there, talking to the pretty robin, she saw him hop over to a little place on the ground where the earth had been turned up. It was like a very small hill of dirt under some bushes. A dog had been digging there, looking for a rabbit. Mary looked at this area without knowing why. She saw something lying in the dirt that was a little bit shiny. She walked over to look at it. It was a large, old key with a thick metal ring attached to it. Mary picked it up and looked at it. She was amazed and a little bit frightened, although she didn't know why. "Perhaps this key has been buried in the ground for 10 years, she whispered. "Maybe it's the key to the secret garden." Chapter 8. The Robin Shows the Way. Mary looked at the key for a long time. All she could think about was that the key might let her into the secret garden. If she could only find where the door was, she could open it and discover what was behind the walls. To Mary, the garden was a wonderful mystery. If she could only enter the garden, it might be different and better than other places. I could have my own secret place to play in. No one would ever know, thought Mary happily. Everyone would think that the key was still hidden and the door was locked. Mary loved the idea of having a secret from everyone else.
Since arriving at Misselthwaite Manor,
Mary's mind and body had begun to wake up a little. Being the only child in an enormous house with many rooms is a very strange thing. and there wasn't any doubt that the cold, fresh English air was continuing to make her strong and healthy. As her body grew stronger, her mind began to work more. So Mary was very interested in the discovery of the old key and the mystery of the garden. Mary put the key in her pocket and walked up and down. She looked at the garden walls. There were many thick green vines covering the walls, so that you couldn't see the bricks underneath. Mary felt a little frustrated. There just had to be a door somewhere.
It seems so silly to be so close to the garden, and yet not to be able to enter.
Mary decided to always keep the key with her in case she ever found the door. The next morning, when Mary woke up, Martha was there. She had returned from her visit to her family and was feeling quite happy. As Mary ate, Martha told her about her visit. She had helped with the washing and the baking, and in the evening the whole family had sat around the fire.
Martha had told her brothers and sisters all about the new girl at Misselthwaite Manor, who was from India.
The children loved hearing about you. Their eyes almost fell out of their heads when I told them about the black people and the ship you arrived in and everything. Mary thought a little. I'll tell you more stories of India, so the next time you go home you have more to talk about. Do you think the children would like to hear about riding on elephants and camels and snake charmers and magic men? Oh, my! Cried Martha. Of course they would. Would you really do that, Miss Mary? Yes, India is very different from England, said Mary. Did Dickon and your mother like to hear you talk about me? Why, of course. Dickon loved it. However, my mother was a little worried about you because you're alone so much, said Martha. Mother said, hasn't Mr. Craven got a governess for her? I don't want a governess, said Mary loudly. Well, I told Mother that he'll probably not think about it for a few years. But Mother said you should be studying and you should have a woman to take care of you. She also said, now, Martha, just think how you would feel, a little girl with no mother, all alone in a big house. Make sure to cheer her up. I told her I would try. Mary looked at Martha for a long time. You do cheer me up. I like to hear you talk, she said. Then Martha left the room and came back with something in her hand. I've brought you a gift. It's from Mother. A gift? Said Mary. How could someone with 14 hungry people to feed give anyone a gift? It's a jumping rope. Mother got it from a man who was selling them near our house, said Martha. She said to me, well, Martha, you've given me your month's salary like a good girl. I've only got a few small coins, but I'm going to buy that child a jumping rope. She might enjoy it. Mary looked at the jumping rope. It had 2 red and blue wooden handles. However, she had never seen a jumping rope before. What do you do with it? She asked. Martha laughed. Watch, she said. She took a handle in each hand and began to jump over the rope. First she was slow. Then she was faster and faster. She skipped as she jumped. Mary could see her cheeks getting red. Martha went on skipping and jumping over the rope until she'd done it 100 times. Then she stopped. I could skip longer than that. I've skipped 500 times at once before. But I wasn't as fat then as I am now, Martha said and laughed. Mary felt excited. Your mother is a kind woman. Do you think I could learn to do that? Just practice. You'll be slow at first, but you'll get better. Mother said the jumping rope is one of the best things for a child to do. You'll get more strength in your arms and legs, and be out in the fresh air. Mary tried jumping rope a few times. She was slow. "Put on your coat and go outside and practice," said Martha. "Mother said I must tell you to play outside as much as possible, just as long as you keep warm." Mary put on her coat and got her jumping rope. Suddenly she turned to Martha. "Martha," she said slowly, "it was your money, really. Thank you for the jumping rope." Martha just laughed. "Run outside and play." The jumping rope was a wonderful thing. Mary jumped rope until her cheeks were very red. The sun had begun to shine and a fresh wind blew. Mary skipped around some of the gardens. She saw Ben Weatherstaff working and talking to the robin, which was hopping on the ground next to him. Using the jumping rope, Mary skipped over to him. Ben looked at her curiously. Mary wanted him to notice her.
"Well,"
he said,
"what a surprise. Perhaps you're a real child after all, instead of a sour old woman. Your cheeks are nice and red."
"I've never jumped rope before," said Mary. "I can only jump 20 times in a row."
"Keep practicing,"
said Ben.
"Look, the robin is watching you. He followed you yesterday, and he'll do it again. He wants to know what a jumping rope is."
Mary jumped rope along the gardens for a while. Soon she decided to practice near the walls of the secret garden. She soon found that she could jump more than 20 times in a row. She was very hot, but she felt good. She looked down at the ground, and there was the robin. "Well, Robin, you showed me the key to the garden. Now you should show me the door, but I don't think you know where it is," said Mary, smiling at the bird. The robin looked at Mary, as if to say,
"What do you think?"
He jumped onto the tree and sang a loud, lovely song. Now, Mary Lennox had heard a lot about magic from her Indian Ayah's stories. In later years, Mary always said that what happened to her at this very moment was magic. The wind began to blow suddenly. The wind was strong enough to blow the branches of the thick green vines that covered the walls of the secret garden.
Mary, who had stepped close to the robin, suddenly jumped out and caught the vines in her hand. She had seen something.
It was a doorknob. Mary put her hands under the thick leaves. She pulled and pushed them aside. Yes, there was a door in the wall of the secret garden. She had found it. Mary's heart was pounding with excitement. The robin was singing loudly, as if he were just as excited, and the door had a keyhole.
Mary took out the old key from her pocket. She pushed it in the keyhole. She had to turn the key with both hands, but it worked.
Then Mary took a deep breath and looked around her. There was no one coming. No one had seen her open the door. Mary pushed back the leaves again and opened the door. It hadn't been opened in 10 years, so it opened very slowly. Then she went through the door and shut it behind her. She stood around looking amazed. She was standing inside the secret garden. Chapter 9. Behind the Garden Walls. Mary couldn't imagine a more wonderful place than the secret garden. It seemed that the garden's owner had loved roses, for the garden was filled with many rose bushes and rose vines. They looked brown, dry, and dead, however. So did the grass. The rose vines dropped onto the trees like curtains. If this garden were green, how many roses there would be, thought Mary. How still and quiet it is here. The robin was sitting on a tree in the garden. He didn't sing anymore. He only looked at Mary, as if to see what she would do next. Of course it's quiet, whispered Mary to herself. I'm the only person who's been in here for 10 years. She began to explore the garden. I wonder if all these trees and plants are really dead, she thought.
Is this a dead garden? Oh, I wish it wasn't. Just think how many roses there would be if this garden were alive.
If Mary had been a gardener, like Ben Weatherstaff, she would have been able to tell whether a plant was dead or not. But she wasn't. All she saw were many brown and gray trees, vines, and bushes. They certainly looked dead, but suddenly Mary gave a little cry. In one corner of the garden there was a patch of black dirt. In the dirt were tiny green plants. Mary remembered what Ben Weatherstaff had said. She bent down to look at them. Yes, they're tiny green growing things. They might be little flowers, like Ben said. So it isn't a completely dead garden. Even if the poor roses are dead, there are other things that are alive,
she said softly. She felt extremely happy. She went around the garden to see if there were more tiny green plants. Happily, they were everywhere.
It seemed to Mary that the little plants didn't have room to grow because of the dead grass all around them. The grass seemed to be choking the plants. She found a sharp stick and dug up the dead grass until there were clear spaces around a few of the plants. There, now you have some room to breathe in, she said. I'm going to help as many of these plants as I can today. Then I'll come back tomorrow and the next day and do more, she said. She was very happy with this idea. Mary went from place to place. She removed dead grass and weeds from around the little green plants. How happy she was! She soon became very warm and took off her coat. She breathed in the smell of the fresh black soil. She didn't realize that she was smiling as she worked. The little plants looked so much better when they didn't have all the dead grass around them. The robin was watching Mary with great interest. He was very pleased to see someone working in his garden at last. Mary worked in the garden until it was time for lunch. She had worked for 3 hours, but the time had passed quickly. I'll return right after lunch, she said. She spoke to the trees and bushes as if they might hear her. Quickly and quietly she opened the old door, and then closed it. She made sure to hide the door behind the vines. Then she returned to the house. At lunch, Mary ate 2 plates of food. She was so hungry. Martha was happy. Won't Mother be pleased when she finds out? She said. Martha, said Mary, do you know anything about growing flowers? Not much, said Martha, but Dickon does. Oh, he's got so many flowers planted in his garden. He can make a flower grow out of a brick wall. Mother says he just whispers to things and they grow. Do roots under the ground live a long time? I mean, would they live years and years, even if no one helped them? Asked Mary.
Some do. Those flowers that have special roots, called bulbs, can live a long time with no help. That's why poor people like us can grow them. Dickon has lots of bulb flowers in his garden, like daffodils and snowdrops.
Mary was finished with her lunch. She went and sat by the fire. I wish I had some little garden tools, she said slowly. What do you want those for? Asked Martha, smiling. Mary thought carefully. The hidden garden must remain a secret. If she told anyone, Mr. Craven might find out. Then he would be terribly angry and get a new key made and lock the garden up forever. Well, this is such a big, lonely house. I have no one to play with, and you and Ben Weatherstaff have to do your work. If I had some little garden tools, I could make a garden, if Ben would give me some seeds." Martha said, "Wow, I'm amazed. Mother said the same thing to me. She said, 'There's so much land in that place, why don't they give her a little land for herself? Even if she doesn't plant anything but herbs, she'd enjoy herself.' Those were the words she said." "Your mother knows a lot of things, doesn't she?" asked Mary. "Oh, yes," said Martha. "Mother says a woman who brings up 12 children learns something besides her letters." "How much would some garden tools cost?" asked Mary.
"There's a little shop in the village that sells them. There's a set of tools that has a little rake, a fork, and a spade all tied together. The set costs only a few coins, I think. Now I have an idea. The shop also sells bags of flower seeds for a penny each. Our Dickon knows which flowers to plant and how to make them grow. Like I told you. Do you know how to write?" she asked.
"Of course," said Mary. "If you can write, we could send a letter to him. I could ask him to go and buy you some seeds and garden tools." "Oh, you're a nice girl," cried Mary. "You really are. You tell me what to write, and I'll write it." "I'll go and get a pen and paper," said Martha, and left the room. Mary waited anxiously. "If I have some seeds and tools," she whispered to herself, "I can try to make the secret garden beautiful again." It was a long time before Martha came back, because she had duties to do for Mrs. Medlock. When she returned, they sat down and worked on the letter. Martha told Mary what she wanted to say, and Mary wrote it. Here is the letter. "My dear Dickon, I hope you are well as I am. Will you take this money, it is Miss Mary's, and go and buy her some seeds and garden tools? Pick the seeds that are the easiest to grow, but will make pretty flowers. Miss Mary has never gardened before because she has lived in India, which is different. Give Mother and the others my love. Miss Mary says she will tell me more stories of India, so that when I next return home, you can hear about elephants, camels, and gentlemen hunting lions and tigers. Your loving sister, Martha Phoebe Sowerby. Now we'll put the money in the envelope.
And I'll tell the farm boy to take it to Dickon. Dickon will bring the things to you himself,"
said Martha. "Oh, I never thought I would meet Dickon," said Mary. "I never saw a boy who animals loved."
Martha thought for a minute. "Do you know, I forgot to tell you something. Mother said she'd ask Mrs. Medlock if you could come and visit our cottage someday."
"Really?" cried Mary. She wanted nothing more than to visit the house, which sounded so warm and happy. It seemed as if all good and interesting things were happening that day. "If I went to your house, I would meet your mother as well as Dickon and your brothers and sisters. I would see the moor and the blue sky," said Mary. She was beginning to feel sleepy because of the excitement of the day. She and Martha sat comfortably together in front of the fire until Mary was asleep. Chapter 10. Dickon. For 1 week after this, the sun shone on the secret garden. Mary loved being inside the garden's walls, safely hidden away from the world. It was like being in a magical land. Because of her time spent in the garden, Mary was beginning to like being outside. She no longer hated the strong winds. She could run faster and longer, and she was becoming stronger. Mary was a strange, determined little girl, and now she had something to work for. She spent hours in the garden that week. She pulled up dead grass and weeds. She found more and more little green plants every day. She wondered how long it would be before the plants turned into flowers. When they came, there would be hundreds of them. During that week, Mary became more friendly with Ben Weatherstaff. They talked a little and watched the robins sing and hop about. Ben was not used to company, but he secretly enjoyed seeing Mary. One day during that week, Ben asked her,
"How long have you been here?"
"About a month," said Mary.
"You're beginning to look like a real little girl. You're a little fatter and not so yellow and ugly. When you first came here, I said to myself, I've never seen an uglier, more sour-faced child."
Mary did not care much about her looks, so this comment did not bother her. "I know I'm fatter," she said. "My dresses are a little tighter now. Look, Ben Weatherstaff, here comes the robin." The robin looked especially good that day. His little gray and red body was fat and shiny, and his black eyes were bright. He seemed to be trying to make Ben Weatherstaff admire him.
"Oh, there you are,"
said Ben.
"You'll come and talk to me when you haven't got anyone better. I know what you've been doing. You've been seeing some lady robin. You'll be telling her you're the bravest bird on the moor."
The little bird looked at Ben and hopped so close that Mary could almost touch him. Then he did an amazing thing. He flew and sat on top of Ben's gardening tool, only inches from his face. Ben stood still as if he were afraid to breathe. He didn't want to say anything, or the robin might fly away.
"I don't believe it,"
he whispered.
"You know how to amaze a fellow, that's for sure."
He stood there without moving until the robin sang a little song and flew away. Ben looked at his gardening tool as if it were a magic thing. He didn't say anything for a few moments, but he kept smiling. Mary wasn't afraid to speak to him. "Do you have a garden, Ben Weatherstaff?" she asked.
"No,"
said Ben. "But if you had one, what would you plant in it?"
"Cabbages and potatoes and onions,"
said Ben. "But what if you wanted to grow flowers? What would you plant then?" continued Mary.
"Oh, sweet-smelling flowers, mostly roses."
Mary was excited. She remembered the rose vines in the secret garden. "Do you like roses?" she asked.
"Yes, I do. A young lady I worked for loved them, and she taught me all about them."
She had a lot of roses in a place she liked.
"And she loved them like they were children."
said Ben.
That was 10 years ago.
"Where is she now?" asked Mary.
"Heaven,"
said Ben. "What happened to her roses? Did they die when she did?"
"Well, for a few years after she died, I went and took care of the roses. I don't do that anymore, because I'm old and stiff. But I think many of them lived."
Mary was more and more excited. "Ben Weatherstaff, when some roses have no leaves and look gray and brown and dry, how do you know if they're dead or alive?" she cried. She had forgotten to be careful.
"When the spring comes, look at the branches of the rose plants. If you see a small bump on the branches, they're alive. After a warm rain, you'll see what happens. Now see here. Why do you care about roses so much, all of a sudden?"
he said, looking closely at Mary. Mary's face grew red. "Well, I want to pretend that I have a garden," she said slowly. "There is nothing for me to do. I have nothing and no one."
"That's true,"
said Ben slowly as he watched her.
"You haven't."
Mary wondered if he felt sorry for her. She stayed with him for 10 minutes more, asking him as many questions as she dared. He answered her in his strange way, but Mary thought that he might be beginning to like her a little. She stayed with him until he said,
"Now look here. Go and play. You ask too many questions. I'm finished talking for today."
Instead of being angry, Mary cheerfully told him goodbye and left. She thought to herself that she liked old Ben, although he was cross. She wanted to keep talking with him, and he seemed to know everything in the world about flowers. As Mary turned a corner, she saw a very strange thing. She couldn't believe her eyes. A boy was sitting under the tree, playing a little wooden pipe. He was a funny-looking boy, about 12 years old. He had red cheeks and bright blue eyes. They were as blue and bright as the sky. But the most amazing thing was that there were animals all around him. A squirrel and 2 rabbits were sitting near him. They didn't seem afraid at all. They almost seemed to be listening to the music. When the boy saw Mary, he spoke to her in a low voice.
"Don't you move,"
he said.
"It would scare them."
Mary didn't move. The boy put his pipe in his pocket and stood up, so slowly that he hardly moved at all. When he did, the rabbits and squirrel moved away. They still didn't seem frightened, however.
"I'm Dickon,"
said the boy.
"I know you're Miss Mary."
Mary realized that she had known this was Dickon from the beginning. Who else could it have been? Dickon had a wide smile, and it filled his whole face.
"I stood up so slowly because wild animals don't like it when you move fast. You have to move slow and speak softly."
He spoke to Mary as if he had known her a long time. However, Mary knew nothing about boys, so she felt a little shy. "Did you get Martha's letter?" she asked.
"Yes, that's why I came,"
said Dickon. He pointed to a little package on the ground.
"I've got your garden tools and seeds."
"Will you show the seeds to me?" asked Mary. Looking at Dickon's friendly face, she forgot to be shy. "Let's sit on this log and look at them together," she said. They sat down and Dickon took out a package. Inside were small envelopes of seeds.
"Here are some poppy seeds, and here's some mignonette. Mignonette flowers are the sweetest smelling in the world. They'll grow wherever you plant them."
The same as the poppies.
He explained to Mary how to water the seeds and what they would look like when they became flowers.
"Listen,"
he said suddenly.
"I'll plant them for you myself. Where's your garden?"
Mary's face turned red, then white. She hadn't thought of this before. How could she tell Dickon about the secret garden? She didn't know what to say. Dickon saw her reaction.
"Haven't you got a garden yet?"
he asked.
"Wouldn't they give you a little one?"
Mary's eyes were huge as she looked at him. "I don't know anything about boys," she said slowly. "If I tell you a very big secret, will you promise not to tell? If anyone else found out, I think I would die," she said, almost angrily. But Dickon just smiled.
"I keep secrets all the time,"
he said.
"If I couldn't keep secrets from the other boys about animals, nests, and things, then no animal on the moor would be safe. Yes, I can keep secrets."
I've stolen a garden," whispered Mary. "It's an old garden, more than 10 years old. Nobody wants it. They never enter it. Perhaps everything in it is dead. I don't know. But I don't care. I don't. I have nothing here. Nothing belongs to me. I found it myself. No one has the right to take it away from me when I love it, and they don't. They're letting it die, all alone," she said and burst into tears. Dickon's blue eyes grew bigger and bigger.
"Ah,"
he said with pity and understanding.
"Where is it?"
he whispered. Mary got up at once. She was feeling a little like the old Mary, sour and angry, but at the same time very worried and upset. "I'll show you," she said. Mary took Dickon to the garden wall. She lifted the thick vines and showed him the door. She was careful to make sure no one was around. When they passed through the garden door, Mary said, "This is the place. It's a secret garden, and I'm the only one who wants it to be alive." Dickon looked around and around him.
"It's a strange, pretty place,"
he whispered.
"It's like a place in a dream."
Chapter 11. The Bird's Nest. Dickon began to walk around the garden slowly and softly, like a cat. He seemed to notice everything, the gray vines, brown trees, and stone benches.
"I never thought I'd see this place,"
he said at last. Mary was shocked. "Did you know about it?" she whispered.
Martha told me there was one garden at Misselthwaite that no one went into. I used to wonder what it was like,"
he said. His eyes looked happy as he explored the garden.
"There will be lots of birds' nests here in the spring. It's quiet and safe here."
"Oh, Dickon, will there be roses in the spring? I mean, do all the roses look dead?" said Mary.
"Oh no, not all of them,"
he answered.
"Look at this."
He took out a knife from his pocket and cut into a very large, tall bunch of rose branches.
"Do you see how the inside looks a little green and wet?"
he asked.
That means it's alive. If the wood looks dry and breaks off in your hand, it's dead. There's a lot of dead wood in this garden that should be cut out, but I think plenty is probably still alive.
"Do you really think so?" Mary whispered excitedly. "I'm so glad. I want everything to be alive. Let's go around the garden and see." Dickon was excited as she was. They went around the garden, testing all the rose branches and bushes.
The weakest branches have died, but the stronger ones are still alive. If all the old wood is cut out and everything is taken care of, why, there will be a fountain of roses here this summer,"
Dickon said.
Mary learned to tell which wood was alive and which was dead.
Dickon showed her how to use the garden tools. They were busy working on one rose bush when Dickon said with surprise,
"Why, who did that there?"
He was pointing to the little space Mary had made for the little green flower shoots.
"I did it," said Mary. "Those flower shoots were so little, and they looked like they couldn't breathe with all the dead grass and weeds around."
"Well, you did that just like a gardener,"
Dickon said.
"They'll start growing quickly now. Just you wait and see."
He ran all around the garden inspecting Mary's work. He took handfuls of the dark black soil and smelled it.
"There's a lot of work to be done here,"
he said happily. "Oh, please, will you come again and help me do it?" Mary asked. "I'm fatter and stronger now. I won't get tired. I can dig and pull up weeds and do whatever you tell me. Do come, Dickon."
"I'll come every day if you want me,"
said Dickon firmly.
"It's the most fun I ever had, waking up a secret garden."
"If you do help me make the garden alive, I don't know what I'll do," said Mary. What could you do for a boy like Dickon?
"I'll tell you what you can do. You'll get stronger and hungry as a young fox, and learn to talk to the birds like I do. We'll have a lot of fun,"
Dickon said with his wide smile. He walked around, looking at the trees and bushes thoughtfully. They talked about what flowers they would plant. They agreed that they didn't want a clean, neat-looking garden. They wanted it to look wild and natural and filled with many kinds of flowers. Sitting on the ground, Mary said, "Dickon, you are as nice as Martha said. I like you, and that makes 5 people. I never thought I would like 5 people. When I was in India, I hated everyone." Dickon looked just like Martha with his round blue eyes and red cheeks.
"You only like 5 people?"
he said cheerfully.
"Who are the other 4?
"Your mother and Martha, and the robin and Ben Weatherstaff," said Mary.
Dickon laughed so loudly that he put his hand over his mouth.
"Well, I know you think I'm a strange boy,"
he said.
"but I think you're the strangest girl I ever knew."
Then Mary did something she had never done before. She leaned forward and said, "Do you like me?"
"Oh, of course. I like you a lot. And so does that robin, I think."
The robin had flown into the garden and was sitting in a tree watching them and singing. Suddenly, Mary heard a loud bell ringing. This meant that it was time for lunch. "Oh, no, I have to go in and eat lunch. I'm hungry, but I don't want to go," she said.
"Run along and eat. I'll be here when you get back. I'll give the robin a bit of my sandwich. He'll like a bit of bread,"
Dickon said. Mary almost felt that Dickon was a magic person who would disappear when she left him. He seemed too good to be true. She slowly walked to the garden door, but then turned around.
"Dickon, whatever happens, you never would tell anyone, would you?"
"Now, if you were a little bird, and you showed me your nest, do you think I'd tell anyone?"
he asked.
"You're as safe as a bird with me."
And Mary knew she was. Chapter 12. Meeting Uncle Archibald. Quickly, Mary ran back to her rooms. Her lunch was waiting, and Martha was there with it. "Martha, I've seen Dickon. He brought me those garden tools and seeds," Mary cried as she sat down. "I knew he'd come. What do you think of him?" I think he's beautiful," said Mary firmly. Martha laughed. "Well, we always thought he was wonderful, but we never thought he was handsome. His nose turns up too much." "I don't care. I like it. I like everything about him," said Mary. "Where are you going to plant your seeds?" asked Martha. Mary was nervous. She hoped Martha wouldn't ask too many questions about this. "Well, I haven't asked where I can plant them yet," she said. "Well, don't ask the head gardener, Mr. Roach. He's too busy. I'd ask Ben Weatherstaff if I were you. He might look cross, but he's really a nice man. Mr. Craven lets him do what he likes because Ben and Mrs. Craven were very good friends. Ben used to make her laugh," says Mr. Craven. "Perhaps Ben can find you a little piece of land somewhere." Mary ate her lunch as quickly as she could. Just as she was about to put on her coat and run back outside, Mrs. Medlock entered the room. "Martha, help the child to put on her best dress. Mr. Craven is going away tomorrow for a long time, and he wants to see her before he goes. I'll come back in 10 minutes," she said. She looked nervous and excited and immediately left the room. Mary was terrified. Why did her uncle want to see her? What would she say to him? Probably he would not like her, and she would not like him. They would sit there in silence. Martha helped her to dress and brush her hair. When Mrs. Medlock returned, she took Mary to a part of the house she had never been to before. At last, Mrs. Medlock knocked on a large, strong door.
Come in,
Mary heard someone say, and they entered the room. Mary was trembling. "This is Miss Mary, sir," said Mrs. Medlock.
You can leave now, Mrs. Medlock. I will ring the bell when I want you to take her away,"
said the man. Now he and Mary were alone. Mary stood there, a thin, plain child. She bit her lip. She noticed that her uncle didn't have a lump on his back after all. "Basil just made that up," she thought. Uncle Archibald was very thin and pale, and had black hair with many white streaks. He looked sad and tired.
"Come here,"
he said. Mary went to him. His face might have been handsome, but it was extremely unhappy. He looked worried and nervous as he stared at Mary. At the same time, he seemed to be thinking about other things.
"Are you well?"
he asked her. "Yes," said Mary.
"Do they take care of you?"
"Yes," said Mary. She didn't know what to say.
"You are very thin,"
he said.
"I forgot about you. How could I remember you? I meant to find you a teacher or nurse, but I forgot."
"Please," Mary began, but could not say any more. She thought she might cry.
"What do you want to say?"
asked her uncle. "Please don't make me have a teacher just yet, and I'm too big for a nurse," said Mary softly. Her uncle stared at her and looked thoughtful.
"That was what the Sowerby woman said. I saw her in the village one day, and she spoke to me about you."
"She is Martha's mother, isn't she?" asked Mary. "She knows about children. She has 12 of them."
"What would you like to do instead?"
asked her uncle. Mary felt a little braver, but she was still afraid of him. I want to play outside," she whispered. "I am getting fatter and stronger. I like it here more than in India. There I was always sick and thin. Here I run around and look to see what is growing in the gardens. I won't make any trouble. I promise, sir," she said.
"Don't look so frightened,"
he said in a worried voice.
"Of course you don't make trouble. You may do what you want."
"Can I?" Mary said. She looked him in the eyes for the first time.
"Of course you can. You are only a little girl, and I am your guardian. I am a bad guardian for a child, because I am always sick and busy and unhappy. But I want you to be happy and comfortable. I don't know anything about children, but Mrs. Medlock and Martha will make sure you have what you need. Now that I have seen you, I think Mrs. Sowerby was right. She was brave to speak to me, but she said intelligent things. Play outside as much as you like. You may go wherever you want. Is there anything you want? Toys, books, or clothes?"
"Please, sir," said Mary shyly, looking at the ground. "Could I have a small piece of land?" Her uncle looked very surprised.
"Land?"
he said.
"What do you mean?"
"To make a small garden, to plant things, to watch them grow," whispered Mary. Her uncle walked slowly across the room. He seemed to be remembering something, or thinking about something.
"Do you care about gardens so much?"
"I never knew about them in India. In India, I was too hot and tired all the time. But here it's different," said Mary. Her uncle's sad eyes were kind as he looked at her.
"You may have as much land as you like. You remind me of someone else who loved gardens and things that grow. When you see a piece of land you want, take it, child, and make it come alive."
"May I take it from anywhere if no one wants it?"
"Anywhere,"
he said.
"Now you must go. I am tired."
He rang a bell to call Mrs. Medlock. When Mrs. Medlock came, he said,
"Mrs. Medlock, I have decided that the child should not begin lessons right now. Let her play outside as much as she wants. Give her simple, healthy food. Don't watch her too closely,"
he said. Mrs. Medlock was secretly happy. She hadn't wanted a little girl to take care of, and had seen Mary as little as possible. "Thank you, sir. I understand," she said.
"Take Miss Mary away now,"
said Mr. Craven. They went back to Mary's room, where Mary was left alone with Martha. "Martha, I can have a garden," she cried, "and I don't have to have a teacher for a long time. He spoke with your mother, and she said I shouldn't. I can do what I want. I can go to your mother's house, and she may come to see me." "Ah, I'm glad. That was nice of him, wasn't it?" said Martha happily. "Martha, he really is a very nice man," said Mary seriously. "He looks so terribly sad, though." She ran to the secret garden as quickly as she could. She hadn't meant to be away for so long. She knew Dickon might not be there because he had to walk 5 miles back home before dark. When she opened the garden door, no one was there. But then she saw a little piece of paper attached to one of the trees. On the paper was a picture of a bird in its nest and these words,
"I will come back."
How she liked that boy. She couldn't wait for tomorrow. Chapter 13. Colin. You never know what the weather will be like in England. Mary woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of rain. She laid in bed and thought, "Oh, the rain came because it knew I didn't want it. I hope it stops by morning." Mary laid in bed and listened to the sound of rain and wind on the moors. She couldn't go back to sleep. How loud the wind was. "The wind sounds just like someone lost outside and crying," she thought. She had been lying in bed awake for 1 hour when something made her sit up. She listened carefully. "It isn't the wind," she said to herself. "I do hear someone crying. It's the same sound as before." Mary got out of bed and opened her door. She looked up and down the hall. She felt she had to solve the mystery of the crying. It seemed even stranger to her than the secret garden. "I'm going to find out what it is," she said. "Everyone is in bed, and I don't care what Mrs. Medlock says. I don't care." Mary found a candle in her room and lit it. Softly, she walked down the hall towards the noise. She knew she had to find the beautiful curtain with the door behind it.
That was where she'd heard
the crying sound before. She tried to follow the sound of the crying. Sometimes the crying stopped, but it always started again. Mary was able to remember her path, and soon she was standing in front of the beautiful curtain. She pushed it aside and opened the door behind it. Now she was standing in a short passage. She could hear the crying very clearly now, but it wasn't loud. It was coming from behind one of the walls. Mary saw a door a few feet down the passage. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. What would she find? She saw a large, beautiful room. In the middle of the room there was a bed, and on the bed a boy lay. He looked about her age, and he was crying unhappily. Mary wondered if she was dreaming. She hadn't expected to find another child. The boy had a small white face, thick dark hair, and enormous gray eyes. He looked like he'd been sick, but he was crying as if he was only tired. Now he stared at Mary.
"Who are you?"
he whispered. He looked very scared.
"Are you a ghost?"
Mary was just as frightened. "No, I'm not. Are you?" He stared at her. His gray eyes were so big that they made his face look smaller.
"No,"
he said finally.
"I am Colin."
"Who is Colin?" Mary asked.
"I am Colin Craven. Who are you?"
"I'm Mary Lennox. Mr. Craven is my uncle," said Mary.
"He's my father,"
said the boy. Mary was shocked. "He's your father? But why didn't they tell me he had a son?" Colin didn't answer her immediately.
"Come here,"
he said. Mary walked over to the bed. Colin put out his hand and touched her sleeping gown.
"You are real, aren't you?"
he said.
"I think you could be a dream."
"I'm not a dream," said Mary. "Here, touch my hand. That feels real, doesn't it? When I came in here, I thought you might be a dream too."
"Where did you come from?"
"From my room. I woke up and couldn't go back to sleep. I heard someone crying, and I wanted to see who it was. Why were you crying?"
Because I couldn't go to sleep either, and my head hurts. What is your name again?"
"Mary Lennox." "So no one told you I had come to live here?"
"No, they would never do that. I would have been afraid you would see me. I won't let people see me and talk about me."
Mary was confused. But why not?
"Because I am always sick like this and have to stay in bed. I don't even walk because I have to take care of my back. It may end up like my father's back, all bent and crooked. My father doesn't want anyone to know about me except the servants. No one is allowed to talk about me. If I live, I might be a hunchback, but I won't live. My father hates it because I am just like him."
"Oh, I knew this house was strange," Mary said. "Everything is like a secret. Are you locked in this room?"
"No, I stay here because I don't want to be moved. It makes me too tired."
"Does your father come and see you?" asked Mary.
"Sometimes, when I'm asleep. But he doesn't want to."
"Why?" Colin looked upset and angry.
"My mother died when I was born. It makes him unhappy to look at me. I remind him of her because I look like her. He thinks I don't know, but I do. I've heard the servants talking.
"Have you been here always?"
Sometimes they take me to the sea, but I won't stay because people stare at me. I won't have people staring at me. I used to wear an iron thing to keep my back straight. But then a doctor from London came to see me and made me take it off. He said I didn't need it. All I needed was fresh air. I hate fresh air, and I don't want to go outside."
"I didn't either when I first came here," said Mary. Colin didn't take his eyes off of Mary.
"I don't want this to be a dream,"
he said. "It isn't. We're both awake and everyone else is asleep. Wait a minute. If you don't like people to see you, do you want me to go away?" asked Mary. Colin grabbed her sleeping gown.
"No,"
he said.
"I would be sure I was dreaming if you went. Stay here and talk to me if you are real. I want to hear all about you."
Mary made herself comfortable. She was curious about Colin, too. "What do you want to know?"
Colin wanted to know how long she had been at Misselthwaite.
He wanted to know where her room was and what she had been doing. Did she hate the moor? Like he did? Where had she lived before? Mary answered his many questions. Colin made her tell him about India and about her journey across the ocean. Mary discovered that because Colin had been sick, he hadn't learned as much as other children. He had never been to school. One of his nurses had taught him to read when he was little. Colin had been given all sorts of nice toys and books because his father was wealthy. He didn't seem to like them much, however.
He could have anything he wanted, and never did anything he didn't want to do.
"Everyone has to do what I want,"
he explained to Mary.
"If I am angry, I become sick. No one thinks I'll live to grow up. How old are you?
I'm 10, said Mary, the same age as you.
How do you know how old I am?
Colin asked, surprised. Because when you were born, the garden door was locked and the key was hidden, and it has been locked for 10 years, said Mary. Colin sat up in bed a little.
What do you mean? What garden? Where is the key?
He asked, very interested. There's this garden that Mr. Craven hates, said Mary nervously. He locked the door and no one knows where he hid the key.
What kind of garden is it?
Asked Colin. I don't know. No one has seen it for 10 years, said Mary slowly. She hadn't wanted to talk about the garden, but she couldn't help it. Colin was too much like herself, all alone with nothing to do. He asked many questions. Where was it? Had Mary ever looked for the door? Hadn't she asked the gardeners? They won't talk about it, said Mary. I think they've been told not to answer questions.
I would make them,
said Colin. Mary began to feel really frightened. What had she done? If Colin could make people talk about the garden, who knew what would happen?
Everyone has to do what I say. If I live, this house and everyone in it will belong to me,
said Colin calmly.
I can make them tell me anything.
Mary looked at the boy. She didn't realize that she and Colin had been raised in a similar way. They were very alike. To Mary, it seemed that Colin thought the whole world belonged to him. Do you really think you'll die? She asked him. She wanted to make him forget the garden.
Oh, probably,
he answered, as if he didn't care.
Ever since I was small, I've heard people say I won't live. They think I didn't understand or hear, but I did.
Do you want to live? Asked Mary.
No,
he answered, almost angrily.
But I don't want to die. When I feel sick, I lie here alone and think about dying until I cry and cry.
Mary didn't know what to say.
Let's talk about something else,
said Colin.
Tell me more about the garden. Don't you want to see it?
Well, I suppose, said Mary in a low voice.
I do, too. I might want to go outside, if I could see that garden. I'm going to make them unlock the door,
said Colin. Mary was horrified. Everything would be ruined. Dickon would never come back. No, don't do that, please, she cried.
But you said you wanted to see it,
said Colin. Mary felt like crying. I do, she said quickly. But if you tell everyone about it, then it won't be a secret anymore. One day, maybe we could find it by ourselves. I mean, if there was a door, then it would be our garden. No one would know about it. Colin thought for a moment.
I never had a secret before,
he said.
It might be nice.
If you don't tell, I feel sure I can find out how to enter the garden. We could find a nice boy to push you in your chair, and we could go there alone. And then, perhaps we can go and plant some seeds and make the garden come alive again. I think it must be almost dead now, but maybe we could make some flowers grow.
That sounds nice,
said Colin softly. He was feeling very sleepy and comfortable.
I wouldn't mind being outside if I was in a secret place where no one could see me. Here I am sleepy. Sit beside me and tell me what you think the garden might look like.
So Mary sat beside Colin and told him about what trees and bushes might be inside the garden, and how many birds might build their nests there because it was safe. She pretended she'd never seen the garden before. Then she told him about the robin and Ben Weatherstaff. Colin enjoyed listening to Mary talk, and his eyes began to close. He felt peaceful and calm for the first time in a long while. Mary felt a little worried. "Colin, what would Mrs. Medlock do if she found out that I was here?" she asked.
"She will do what I tell her to do. I will tell her I want you to come and talk to me every day. I'm glad you came,"
answered Colin. "So am I. I'll come as often as I can," said Mary. "But I am going to be busy, you know. I have to find that garden door."
"Yes, of course. You can tell me about it afterwards."
Now Mary was feeling sleepy herself. "I've been here a long time," she said. "You must feel sleepy. Should I go away now?"
"I wish I could fall asleep before you left me,"
said Colin, a little shyly. "Close your eyes, and I'll sing you an Indian song my Ayi used to sing to me," said Mary. Somehow she didn't want him to be awake and alone when she left. She took his hand gently and sang softly.
"That is nice,"
he said, very sleepy. Soon his large gray eyes were closed, and Mary could see he was sleeping deeply. She took her candle and left the room as softly as a ghost. Chapter 14. An Indian Prince. During the next week, it was cold and rainy. Mary didn't like this at all, because there was no chance to see the secret garden or Dickon. However, she was able to spend time with Colin. She didn't enjoy this quite as much as being in the garden with Dickon, but she wanted to know her cousin better. Colin had many picture books, and they read them while having tea. Mary told Colin about Dickon and his animals, and about that family's life in the cottage. Colin liked hearing about these things. They were real life. Mary was always careful when she spoke of the secret garden. She needed to know if Colin was the kind of boy who could keep a secret, like Dickon. She wasn't sure yet. And if Colin could be trusted with the secret, what then? Was there a way to take Colin into the garden without anyone else finding out? Mrs. Medlock, Martha, and Colin's doctor were shocked when they discovered Mary and Colin together the afternoon after they'd first met.
"Well, my boy, I don't know if Miss Mary should be here. Too much excitement is not good for your health,"
said the doctor to Colin. Colin began to look angry.
"I will be very excited if she leaves,"
he said loudly.
"She will stay. She makes me better. She will come and see me every day."
Mary thought to herself that Colin was like an Indian prince. He told people what to do, and they did it. The servants were afraid that if Colin got angry and became ill, they'd lose their jobs. But stubborn little Mary was not afraid of the Indian prince. "Ha! If Colin gets angry at me, I'll never go and see him again," she thought to herself. Finally, the rain stopped. Mary woke up very early. The sky was a soft pink and blue, and no one else was awake yet. Spring was here. The warm sun would make the flowers grow in the garden. "I can't wait. I'm going to see the garden before breakfast," thought Mary. She got dressed quickly and ran outside. When she entered the garden, she was surprised and happy to see that Dickon was there. And he brought some animals with him. There was a large black bird, a squirrel, and a little fox. They were sitting in the garden watching Dickon, who was busy working. "Dickon!" cried Mary. "How could you get here so early?" "Why, the sun has just come up." Dickon laughed.
"How could I stay away?"
he said.
"The air was so fresh, and the fields looked so green and alive. I couldn't stay in bed. I ran over here, shouting and singing. The garden was waiting.
"Dickon, I am so happy I can hardly breathe," said Mary. All around her, small flower shoots were beginning to come up. Little green plants were poking out of the ground.
Soon they'd become flowers. Dickon showed her some flowers that had already bloomed. They were called crocuses, and they were purple and gold. The crocuses looked so little and pretty that Mary wanted to kiss them.
Mary and Dickon worked for hours that morning. Dickon showed her the rose bushes and the vines. They were looking much better. Mary could see the wonderful green bumps in the wood, which meant that the plant was alive and would grow roses. They dug and pulled weeds and laughed so much that Mary's cheeks were almost as red as Dickon's. They discovered something wonderful. Ben Weatherstaff's robin was building a nest in the garden.
"We mustn't bother him,"
whispered Dickon.
"He's found some lady robin. He's very busy now and won't want to talk to us. We've got to be quiet and pretend we don't notice him, or he'll leave."
"Let's not talk about him, or I'll look at him," whispered Mary. "I wanted to tell you something. Do you know about Colin?" Dickon looked at her.
"What do you know about him?"
he said quietly. "I've seen him. I've talked to him every day this week," said Mary. "He says it makes him feel better. He doesn't think about being sick and dying when I'm there."
"I'm happy about that,"
said Dickon seriously.
"It makes me feel better. I knew I couldn't say anything about that poor boy, and I didn't like it."
"How did you know about Colin?" asked Mary.
"Well, everyone around here knew Master Craven had a little boy who would probably die young or be a cripple. We knew Master Craven didn't want us to talk about him. Everyone's so sorry for Master Craven because poor Mrs. Craven was such a beautiful young lady, and they loved each other. Mrs. Medlock's friends with Mother, and she visits our house whenever she's nearby. She's talked to Mother about Master Colin before. Mrs. Medlock doesn't mind us children knowing about him. We wouldn't ever tell."
Mary told Dickon the story of the night she'd met Colin. "His eyes are so big, Dickon. They're so large and gray, and his face is so white. I thought he was a ghost at first."
"Those eyes are just like his mother's, they say,"
Dickon said.
"They say Master Craven doesn't want to see Master Colin when he's awake because his eyes are so like his mother's. But they look so different in the boy's miserable face."
"Do you think he wants to die?" whispered Mary.
"No, but he wishes he'd never been born,"
said Dickon sadly.
"Mother says that's the worst feeling in the world. Children who aren't wanted don't really live. Master Craven would buy the boy anything in the world, but he wants to forget he exists. Master Craven's afraid that one day Colin will be a hunchback."
"Colin's afraid of that himself. He won't even sit up," said Mary. "He says that if he feels a lump growing on his back, he'll go crazy and scream himself to death."
"Oh, he shouldn't think things like that. No one could get well who thought that way,"
said Dickon, looking scared. He bent down and stroked the little fox, who was sitting next to them. After a moment, he said,
"Do you see anything different about the garden? It's looking greener. It looks more alive, now that we're taking care of it."
Mary saw that it was true. The rose vines didn't look so brown and dry. They looked alive. "It will be greener and greener until the brown is gone."
"That's right. Do you know, I wonder if Master Colin would like to be out here. If he was with us, watching the flowers grow, he wouldn't have time to think about dying. He'd be healthier. It would be better than any doctor's medicine,"
said Dickon. "I've been thinking the same thing," said Mary. "If Colin could keep the garden a secret, maybe you could push his chair and we could bring him here. The doctor said he should have fresh air after all. Colin doesn't want people to see him. He could order the gardeners to stay away from us. Then no one would see where we went. He loves to hear me talk about the garden because it's a secret," said Mary. "I don't tell him much, but he said he wanted to see it someday."
"We'll bring him out soon,"
said Dickon.
"Now look, the robin and his lady are building their nest."
They had a lot of work to do that morning. Mary was a little late for lunch. She was in such a hurry to return to the garden that she'd forgotten about Colin. "Martha, tell Colin I can't come and see him yet. Dickon and I are very busy working on our garden," said Mary. Martha looked frightened. "Ah, Miss Mary, it may make him angry when I tell him that." But Mary wasn't afraid of Colin, like everyone else. She also wasn't a very sensitive little girl. Now, it is true that she was becoming kinder and nicer, but she was still similar to the old Mary Lennox. "I can't stay," she said. "Dickon is waiting for me." The afternoon was even better than the morning. Already, almost all the weeds had been removed. Most of the roses and the trees had been taken care of. Dickon had taught Mary to use all her tools. It was clear that before springtime was through, the garden would be filled with beautiful growing things. There would be apple and cherry trees, and the grass would have hundreds of flowers. The robin and his mate flew through the air singing. The sun was setting when Mary and Dickon said goodbye.
"I'll be at work by dawn,"
said Dickon. "So will I," said Mary. Mary ran back to the house. She wanted to tell Colin all about Dickon's animals and about the springtime. She thought he would enjoy this. So it wasn't very pleasant when Mary found Martha waiting for her. She had a serious face. "What's wrong?" asked Mary. "How's Colin?" "Oh, Miss Mary, I wish you'd gone to him. He was really angry. It's been hard to keep him quiet all afternoon. He's been watching the clock and waiting for you." Mary's little face looked sour. Just like Colin, she wasn't used to thinking of other people. She saw no reason why Colin should prevent her from doing what she wanted to do. Mary had done the same thing in India, however. There, when she'd been sick, she'd made everyone around her miserable just because she was. At the time, Mary felt she was right, but now, of course, she felt Colin was wrong. When Mary went into Colin's room, he was lying in his bed. He didn't turn and look at her when she came in. She went over to him. "Why didn't you get up?" she asked.
"I did get up this morning, when I thought you were coming. My back hurt and my head hurt, and I was tired. Why didn't you come?"
"I was working with Dickon in the garden," said Mary.
"I won't let that boy come here, if you go and stay with him instead of me,"
said Colin. Mary really got angry then. She could get angry without shouting or speaking. She just got quiet and stubborn and didn't care about anything. "If you send Dickon away from here, I'll not come to see you again," she said.
"I'll have you when I want you,"
said Colin. "Oh, is that so, little Indian prince?" said Mary angrily.
"Well, you can make me come in here, but you can't make me speak. I'll sit here and won't say a word. I'll look at the floor."
They looked at each other angrily.
You're mean,
cried Colin.
You're just saying that because I won't do what you want. You're meaner than I am,
said Mary.
I'm not. I'm sick, and I'm sure there's a lump growing on my back,
Colin said. He was feeling very sorry for himself.
And I'm going to die.
No, you're not,
said Mary angrily. Colin was extremely angry, but also a little bit pleased. No one had ever told him he would live before.
Yes, I am. You know I am. That's why you're mean. I'm going to die, and you go outside all day instead of coming to talk to me,
he said.
I don't believe it,
said Mary in a hard little voice.
You just say that so people will feel sorry for you. Well, I don't.
Get out of this room,
shouted Colin. He tried to throw a pillow at Mary, but he wasn't strong enough.
I'm going, said Mary, and I won't come back. I was going to tell you about all the things I did today, but now I won't.
Chapter 15. Trouble in the Night. Mary had been up very early that morning, so she went to sleep early. However, she was wakened in the night by horrible sounds. She jumped out of bed. What was it? The next second she knew. It was Colin. Doors were opening and people were running up and down the halls. He was screaming and crying in a horrible way. It sounded like he was dying or going crazy.
It's got to stop,
said Mary. She put her hands over her ears.
It has to. How awful it sounds.
Mary understood why everyone gave Colin what he wanted. They didn't want to hear him. The terrible sounds frightened her, but they also made her angry. How dare Colin act this way?
He should be stopped. Someone ought to beat him until he stops, she cried.
Suddenly, the door opened and Colin's nurse ran into the room. "Can you make him stop, Miss Mary?" she cried. "He'll hurt himself screaming and crying this way. He'll make himself sick. He likes you. Please come and try, like a good girl." Mary didn't waste any time. She ran down the hall to Colin's room. The louder the screams got, the angrier Mary became. By the time she threw open Colin's door, she was ready for a fight. She ran over to his bed.
"Stop it!"
she shouted.
"Stop it right now! I hate you! Everyone hates you! Everyone should leave this house and let you scream until you die. I wish you would."
Now, a nice, ordinary child would never have said these things. But Mary was not a nice, ordinary girl. Fortunately, the shock of hearing someone shouting at him was enough to make Colin stop. His face looked terrible. It was white and red, but Mary did not care.
"If you scream one more time, I'll scream too. I can scream louder than you can, and I'll frighten you," she said.
I can't stop. I can't,
he cried.
"You can,"
shouted Mary.
"The only thing wrong with you is your temper. You're not sick. Just be quiet."
I felt the lump in my back,
cried Colin.
I knew it would come. I'm going to be a hunchback, and then I'll die.
"You did not feel a lump,"
said Mary.
"That's only your imagination. There's nothing wrong with your horrible back. You let me look at it. Nurse, come here and show me his back this minute."
The nurse, Mrs. Medlock, and Martha had been listening outside. The nurse entered. She was very afraid. "I don't think he'll let me," she said.
Show her. She'll see then,
cried Colin. The nurse turned Colin over, and Mary looked at his back. It was a very thin back. You could see all the bones, but there wasn't anything wrong with it.
Ha! There's no lump on your silly back. It's just thin, so you can feel your bones. My back used to look like that, until I became fatter. If you say there is a lump again, I'll laugh at you.
Truthfully, this was the best thing for Colin to hear. He hadn't told anyone about his fears, but if he had talked to his doctor or his nurses, he would have discovered that most of his illnesses and fears were created by himself. Now an angry little girl from India was telling him that his fears were silly. He hoped she was right.
I didn't know the boy thought he had a lump on his back. I could have told him it was fine, said the nurse. It's just weak because he won't exercise it.
Do you think I'll live to grow up?
Asked Colin. Yes, if you take care of yourself and get plenty of fresh air. You must watch your temper, too, said the nurse. Tears ran down Colin's face, but they were tears of relief. Seeing this, Mary's anger went away. Colin put out his hand and she touched it. It was a sort of apology.
I'll go outside with you. Mary, I would like to see Dickon and his animals,
said Colin. He remembered not to mention the secret garden. After everyone else had left, Mary said to Colin, "Do you want me to sing you that Indian song?"
Thank you, Mary. That would be nice,
said Colin softly.
Before, you said you had nice things to tell me. Do you think you have found a way into the secret garden?
Mary looked at Colin's poor, tired face, and she decided to tell him. Yes, I think I have. If you will go to sleep, I'll tell you all about it tomorrow, she said.
Oh, Mary,
whispered Colin.
If I could go into the secret garden, I think I would live to grow up. I would be so much better.
Then she sang to him a little, and soon Colin was asleep. Chapter 16. I Will Live Forever. The next morning, Mary slept very late. When Martha brought her breakfast, she said, "Well, Miss Mary, I don't believe it. This morning, Master Colin asked me, would you please ask Miss Mary if she'll come and see me when she can? Imagine him saying, please." Mary wanted to go straight to the garden. But suddenly, she decided to go and see Colin. She felt that she could trust him with the secret of the garden. When she entered Colin's room, she had her coat and hat with her. She intended to go to the garden after speaking with him.
I'm glad you came,
he said. He looked very tired.
Are you going somewhere?
Well, I'm going to see Dickon soon. I thought I'd tell you something. About the garden.
What is it?
Colin looked excited. Mary felt a little afraid again. Can I trust you? Really, really trust you? I trusted Dickon with the secret. Will you promise never to tell anyone?
I promise, Mary,
whispered Colin. He saw she was very serious. I found the door to the garden. I really found it weeks ago. I wasn't sure if I could trust you, so I didn't say anything. Dickon and I have been working in it, and in summer there will be roses and many other beautiful things. Colin's eyes were as big as plates.
Mary!
He cried.
Oh, will I see it? Will I live to get into it?
He grabbed her hands and pulled her towards him. Don't be ridiculous, said Mary. Of course you'll live to get into it. And Colin saw how silly he was and began to laugh. Mary laughed with him. She told him about what the secret garden was really like. She told him about the wonderful work they were doing there. Soon, they looked like two ordinary children, whispering and laughing. Colin felt better than he ever had in his life. They began to make plans for Colin's visit to the garden.
I have an idea,
said Colin.
I must see this garden tomorrow, if the weather is good. Oh, let it be good. Dickon can push me in my wheelchair. I'll tell all the gardeners to keep away from the place where the secret garden is. I'll just say I want to be left alone. I'm sure it will work.
Meanwhile, the doctor arrived at the house. He hated these visits. He expected the boy to be alone and still angry and upset. He usually was, the morning after his tantrums. But Mrs. Medlock had different news for him. Doctor, you'll never believe it. That sour-faced little girl, who's almost as bad as Colin, has calmed him. Last night she did what all of us are afraid to do. She just ran into the room and yelled at him to stop. She said he was being ridiculous. Now this afternoon, well, you have to see for yourself. Come upstairs. The doctor saw Colin and Mary talking and laughing. Colin actually looked happy. They were looking at some pictures of flowers.
These large purple flowers are called delphiniums,
said Colin. We've got some of those in the garden already, said Mary. Then they saw the doctor and stopped speaking.
Well, my boy, you are looking better after your long night,
said the doctor.
I'm feeling much better. I want some fresh air, so I'm going out in my chair tomorrow, if the weather's nice,
said Colin boldly. The doctor was shocked. Colin had said that he hated fresh air.
Well, all right, but it must be warm tomorrow, and you must dress warmly,
he said nervously.
Never mind, doctor. You may go away now. I do not need any medicine. My cousin makes me better. When I go outside, a very strong boy I know can push my chair,
said Colin.
Who's this boy?
asked the doctor. He's Dickon, said Mary. The doctor smiled. Everyone knew Dickon.
Well, if Dickon goes with you, it will be all right.
When the doctor left, he went straight to Mrs. Medlock.
Sarah, I don't believe it. You were right. That little girl has tamed him, like you tame a wild animal. I didn't have to give him any sleeping pills or do anything for him.
I know. I'm very relieved, said Mrs. Medlock. After a while, Mary left Colin and went to the garden, where she worked happily with Dickon for hours. They had agreed that tomorrow was to be the day of the adventure, if the sun shone. Unfortunately, Mary, Colin, and Dickon's plan had to wait more than a week. First, Colin got a cold, and the weather was also bad. It was cool and windy every day for 10 days. Normally, such a situation would have made Colin terribly angry and upset. But Mary came to see him every day, and he and Mary had such pleasant conversations. They almost always talked about the garden. Mary told him what was growing there. Like Mary, he was also interested in the roses. The rose vines and bushes were becoming greener every day. When summer came, there would be roses of every color: pink, red, white, and yellow. Many other kinds of flowers were growing too. During this time, Colin met Dickon. Mary had wondered what the two boys would think of each other, but she saw she didn't need to worry. Colin just stared and stared at Dickon with amazement in his eyes. He had never talked to another boy before. But Dickon was so natural and not at all embarrassed that Colin didn't feel shy at all. After that, every day Dickon came to the room for a short time. Finally, the weather got better. 10 days after Colin's terrible night, he awakened. He was happy it was morning, which surprised him a little. He usually hated being awake. He could see the warm sun shining outside. This afternoon, if his and Mary's plan worked, he would see the mysterious garden. Colin rang his bell. When his nurse came in, he said,
"Nurse, ask Mary Lennox if she will have breakfast with me here. And go and find Mr. Roach, the gardener. I want to speak to him."
The nurse was surprised, but she did as Colin asked. Half an hour later, Mary and Colin were eating breakfast together. Colin was surprised to find that he was hungry.
"You'll become fatter, just like I did,"
said Mary.
"I used to never want my food, and now I'm always hungry."
Soon Mr. Roach, the gardener, appeared. He had no idea what Master Colin could want, and he was curious about him. He had never seen the boy, but he'd heard stories of the boy's terrible temper and his illnesses. That morning, Colin was sitting in a chair. He had on a red gown that made him look a little like a prince.
"So you are Roach, are you?"
Colin said.
"I want you to do some things." "Very good, sir,"
said Roach. He wondered what the boy would ask.
"This afternoon I am going out in my chair. I will go out every day, if the weather is good. I want you to make sure everyone stays away from the long path by the garden walls. Do you understand? I will go out at 2:00, and everyone is to stay away until I say they may return to work." "Very good, sir. It will be done,"
said Roach. He was glad the boy hadn't told him to chop all the trees down or something like that.
"You may go now, Roach,"
said Colin. He acted just like a prince of England. Mr. Roach almost wanted to laugh. Mary stayed with Colin for the rest of the morning. The nurse would dress Colin at 1:30. Then Dickon would come up and meet them in Colin's room at 2:00. Mary wasn't worried that Colin wouldn't like Dickon. Everyone did. They became more and more excited as the time went by. Finally, the nurse came in to dress Colin. She noticed that instead of lying there, Colin tried to help her a little, and he talked to Mary the whole time. Then they helped him get into his wheelchair. The strongest servant in the house carried Colin in the chair downstairs. Mary saw Dickon waiting for them. He looked excited. When everything was ready, Colin said to the servants,
"You may go now."
They did so, but they were trying not to laugh at the little prince. Outside, it was a beautiful spring day. The wind was warm, the sun shone, the sky was a soft blue. Colin looked around him and breathed deeply.
"There are so many birds singing,"
he said.
"They're all busy building their nests and laying their eggs. And just listen to those bees. They're making honey,"
said Dickon. While they walked, Dickon showed Colin many sorts of flowers. Many of them were now growing in the secret garden. Soon they reached the wall where the door to the secret garden was. Mr. Roach had kept his promise. No one was around.
"I don't see the door,"
said Colin. He was breathing fast, and his eyes were shining with excitement.
"It's hidden. It's right here. Quickly now. Push him in, Dickon. Fast,"
whispered Mary. And Dickon pushed Colin into the garden. Colin had covered his eyes with his hands. When he took them away, he cried out in joy. To Colin, the garden was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The rose vines on the wall were green and healthy. Flowers of every color were growing, and the grass was soft, green, and fresh. There was a sound of birds singing, and delicious smells filled the air. It was sweet and quiet, and the sun was warm on his face. Mary and Dickon stared at Colin in amazement. They noticed the boy's white face filling with pink color as he took deep breaths.
Mary,
He cried,
Dickon, I will get well. I will. The garden's magic will help me, and I will live forever and ever and ever.
Chapter 17. Ben Weatherstaff. Mary had never seen such a beautiful afternoon. Even Dickon, who lived every day outside, shook his head and said,
Well, I've seen a lot of pretty days, but never one as nice as this.
They pushed Colin's chair under a tree. Colin could not stop staring at everything. Mary and Dickon brought him things to look at: small flowers, bird feathers, an eggshell from a bird that had just been born. The cherry and apple trees had white and pink flowers. In summer, there would be delicious fruit to eat. Bees flew everywhere, drinking from the flowers. It was like being in a magical world. Dickon pushed the chair slowly around the garden so Colin could see everything. After a while, Mary and Dickon decided to work a little. They dug and cleaned around the flowers while Colin watched them. Colin kept seeing the birds flying through the air. They were bringing pieces of food to their little ones.
It looks like the birds are having their afternoon tea,
he said to Dickon and Mary. They all laughed at this idea. Soon the thought of afternoon tea made them hungry.
Go and make one of the servants bring some in a basket. You can go and meet them at the kitchen door,
said Colin. It was agreed that this was a very good idea. Soon, they were having a wonderful afternoon meal. There was hot tea and bread and cake. Dickon's little squirrels took pieces of bread and ate them. His large blackbird had a large piece of cake and seemed to enjoy it very much. They ate quietly for a while. Soon, Colin said,
I don't want this afternoon to end, but I'll come back tomorrow, and every day after that. I'll get fresh air every day. I've seen the spring now, and I'll see the summer. I'll watch everything grow here, and I'll grow here too. Certainly you will,
said Dickon.
We'll have you walking and digging with us before long.
Colin's face turned red.
Walk?
He said.
Dig? Will I?
Dickon looked at him carefully. So did Mary. Neither of them knew if anything was really wrong with Colin's legs. Could he walk if he wanted to? Of course you'll walk. You've got legs the same as other people. Mary felt worried until Colin answered.
Nothing's really wrong with my legs,
he said.
They're very thin and weak, however. I always thought I shouldn't walk, and all the doctors and nurses did too. So I haven't tried to for a long time. They shake so much that I'm afraid to try to stand up.
Dickon and Mary both felt better.
When you stop being afraid, you'll stand on them,
said Dickon cheerfully.
And you'll stop being afraid pretty soon. I will?
Said Colin, as if it surprised him. They lay still for a while, enjoying the day. Suddenly, Colin whispered,
Mary, Dickon, who is that man?
Dickon and Mary jumped up and looked where Colin was pointing. Ben Weatherstaff was there, on the other side of the wall. They saw his angry face looking at them. Over the top of the wall, he had climbed up a ladder on the other side. He shook his head at them.
If you were my child,
he cried, looking angrily at Mary.
I'd beat you, that's for sure. I always knew you were a bad child, always asking questions. I don't know why I made friends with you. Now, if it hadn't been for that robin...
But, Ben Weatherstaff, cried Mary, it was the robin who showed me the way in. Ben looked like he wanted to jump over the wall.
That's ridiculous. Don't blame the robin for this,
he said sternly. But Mary could see he was really curious.
How did you ever get in here?
Ben Weatherstaff, I can't tell you when you're shaking your fist at me like that, said Mary. Colin had been watching all this from his chair. Ben hadn't seen him yet. He had to do something.
Push me over there. I want to talk to that man,
he whispered to Dickon. Then Ben Weatherstaff saw something that amazed him. Coming toward him was a large chair that looked like a king's chair. In the chair sat a boy who looked like a prince.
He had enormous gray eyes and was thin and very white.
But to Ben, it seemed that the ghost of Mrs. Craven was looking at him. Colin looked so much like his mother. He couldn't believe his eyes.
Do you know who I am?
Said Colin.
Answer me. Do I know who you are? Of course. Your mother's eyes are looking at me from your face. I don't know how you came here. You're the poor crippled boy.
Colin sat up in his chair. He was not a cripple. He wasn't going to let this poor gardener think so. He might have a weak back, but there was nothing wrong with his legs.
Listen, you. I'm not a cripple,
he cried. He's not, shouted Mary. He's really not, and he's not a hunchback either. I looked, and there's not even one lump there. Ben didn't know what to think. He put his hand over his eyes.
You haven't got bad legs?
He asked.
No,
shouted Colin.
And you haven't got a bad back? Come here, come here.
Colin shouted to Dickon. Dickon ran over to help them.
Take these blankets off me. I'll show him.
Dickon threw off the blankets that covered Colin. Colin's anger gave his body strength. Mary watched him, thinking, he can do it. He can. He can. Slowly, with his hand on Dickon's arm, Colin stood up. He stared at Ben Weatherstaff angrily. His back was straight, and his legs were straight. His head was held up proudly.
There, look at me, you. Just look at me,
he said. Ben Weatherstaff burst into tears. He never thought he would see this boy. He had loved this boy's mother very much. To see her son standing before him was like a miracle.
The lies people tell,
Ben cried.
You're as thin and white as a ghost, but you'll grow up to be a man. I'm your master, while my father is gone.
Colin said to Ben.
You must obey me. This is my garden. You cannot tell anyone we are here. Now, get down from the ladder. Miss Mary will meet you at the door and bring you to me. We did not want you, but now you have to know the secret too. Be quick. My boy,
whispered Ben.
My boy.
He couldn't take his eyes off Colin. Then he seemed to remember where he was.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir,
he said, and climbed down the ladder. Mary ran to meet Ben. While she was doing this, Colin said to Dickon,
Dickon, I am going to walk over to that cherry tree. I want to be standing when Weatherstaff comes here. Put a rug under the tree. When I want to sit down, I will, but not before.
His cheeks were red, and he didn't look tired at all. Dickon held Colin's arm, but Colin was strong on his feet. He slowly walked over to the tree and stood there. Then Mary and Ben Weatherstaff entered. Mary had been telling Ben about Colin's recovery. The important thing that Ben must remember was that Colin was getting well. Nothing could be said about sickness or dying or back problems.
Come here, Weatherstaff,
Colin said to Ben.
Now look at me. Do I have bad legs or a bad back? No, sir,
cried Ben.
It's a miracle. I never thought I'd see you, my boy. What have you been doing all your life? You've been hiding away in your room. Well, that's over now,
said Colin firmly.
Everyone thought I was going to die, but I'm not. Of course you're not. Not you. You've got too much strength in you,
said Ben.
Now sit down on the rug for a while, young master, and give me my orders. What do you do here, Weatherstaff?
asked Colin.
I work in all the gardens,
said Ben.
Master Craven lets me stay here because your mother liked me. My mother?
said Colin. He looked around.
This was her garden, wasn't it? Yes. She loved it very much. She once said to me, Ben, if I'm ever ill or I go away, you must take care of my roses. She loved those roses like they were her children. Well, it's my garden now,
said Colin.
I love it too. I will come here every day. Mary and Dickon have done a lot of work here. You cannot tell anyone. You will come here sometimes and help us, but you must come when no one can see you,
he said to Ben.
Yes, sir. I'll come whenever you want me,
said Ben. He was very happy with this plan.
I'm glad you knew my mother, Weatherstaff,
said Colin.
You'll know how to keep the secret.
Colin picked up Mary's little shovel. He pushed it into the dirt and tried to dig. His hand was still very weak and thin, so he couldn't push very deep. But soon he turned some soil over.
Do you want to plant something, young master?
asked Ben.
I can get you a rose in a pot. Go and get it,
said Colin excitedly. Dickon quickly dug a wide, deep hole in the ground. When Ben brought the rose, he took it out of its pot. He handed it to Colin.
Here, boy,
he said.
Put it in the ground yourself, like a king does when he goes to a new place.
Colin placed the rose in the hole in the ground. Then Dickon and Ben put dirt around the plant. They pressed it down firmly.
It's planted,
said Colin.
Look, the sun is going down. I want to be standing when it leaves the sky. Help me, Dickon.
And when the sun went down, Colin was standing on his feet, laughing. It seemed there really was magic in the garden. Chapter 18. Coming Alive. Now that the sun had gone down, it was time for Mary and Colin to go back to the house. They were both very hungry and couldn't wait to eat. They said goodbye to Ben Weatherstaff.
Make sure to come here tomorrow,
said Colin to Ben. While Dickon was pushing Colin's chair back to the house, Colin had an idea.
Mary and Dickon,
he said,
I am going to get well. I'm going to walk and run and be just like any other boy. When my father returns, I will say to him, Here I am, Father. I am well, and I will live to be a man. But I don't want the servants whispering and asking questions. I will go to the garden every day and practice walking and running until I can do both. But I will go there in my chair and come back in my chair. No one will know I'm well until I walk back to the house and show them."
Dickon and Mary were very impressed. It would be fun to keep this secret from the adults.
When Colin was in his room again, his doctor came to see him.
"You should not have stayed outside so long,"
he said seriously.
"You will become tired and ill again." "No, I won't. I'm not tired at all,"
said Colin.
"I will go to the garden every day from now on." "I don't think I can allow that. It would not be safe for you,"
said the doctor.
"You shouldn't try to stop me. I will go,"
said Colin. He wasn't angry, but he looked very serious. After the doctor had gone, Mary looked at Colin thoughtfully. He probably didn't know how rude he was, always telling people what to do. Mary had once been like that, in India. She had always ordered the servants and never said please or thank you to anyone. However, she had discovered that this behavior was not normal or nice. "I feel sorry for the doctor," she said to Colin.
"Why?"
Colin asked.
"Well, that doctor's taken care of you for 10 years, and you're so terribly rude to him. I never would have done it," Mary said.
"Am I rude?"
Colin asked calmly. He had never thought of it before. "Very," said Mary. "Everyone thought they had to do what you wanted because they thought you were going to die. Everyone felt sorry for you, but they also didn't like you. You were awful to be with."
"I don't want people to feel sorry for me,"
said Colin.
"I won't let people feel sorry for me. I stood up and walked this afternoon."
"It's always having your own way that's made you so rude and strange,"
said Mary honestly. Colin looked a little upset. "But don't worry," she continued. "I'm very strange too. So is Ben Weatherstaff. I was much stranger before I began to like people, and before I found the garden." Colin looked serious.
"I don't want to be poor or strange,"
he said.
"I'm not going to be."
Soon he began to smile.
"I'll stop being strange if I go to the garden every day,"
he said.
"There's magic there. Mary, I know it. It will make me well."
And in the next few months, it seemed that there really was magic in the garden. Every day, Colin was in the garden with Mary and Dickon. Often, Ben Weatherstaff would come and help them care for their plants. The amazing things that happened in the garden. It seemed that the flowers would never stop growing. There were so many kinds of flowers, you could hardly count them all. And the roses, they grew until there were 1,000 of them in the garden. There were mountains of roses. They grew around the tree trunks, over the stone benches, and everywhere. The air was filled with their scent. Ben Weatherstaff planted many special flowers that Colin's mother had loved.
"She always liked these, Master Colin,"
he said one day, pointing to some tall purple flowers.
Your mother liked flowers that always looked up at the sun and sky.
She herself wasn't a lady who looked down at the ground. Not her. She said the blue sky always looked so happy.
Colin kept his promise to himself. Every day he took a walk around the garden. He was very slow at first, and he got tired easily, but he did not give up. He believed that there was some kind of magic in the garden. It gave his arms and legs strength to move. Of course, Colin wanted to walk and run, so he tried very hard. But who's to say there wasn't some magic there? Colin grew very interested in the ways of nature. He would lie on the grass for hours, watching the insects and birds. He was certain that there was some magic in them that made them grow. Sometimes he would talk to Mary, Ben Weatherstaff, and Dickon about magic.
When I grow up, I'm going to be a scientist,
Colin would say.
I will learn about the magic that is in the earth. It is the same magic that is in me. It's the magic that made me want to walk.
The secret garden was not the only garden Dickon worked in. Often, when Mary and Colin didn't see him, he was busy working in his family's garden. They grew cabbages, potatoes, carrots, and herbs. Dickon's mother always said that their vegetables tasted better than anyone else's. One evening
In early summer,
Dickon was working in his garden. He was telling his mother, Mrs. Sowerby, all about Colin and Mary. How they had changed. Mary had become a very pretty girl. She now looked like her mother once had. Colin was looking so much healthier. His face was fuller and his skin was healthy pink instead of pale white. He was always hungry from his daily exercise in the garden.
Of course, Master Colin told us he doesn't want anyone to know,
Dickon told his mother.
If his doctor knew how well Master Colin was doing, he'd write Master Craven. Colin wants to surprise his father when he comes home. But it's hard. Master Colin has to pretend to be sick and weak when he's not. He and Mary have a good time acting. But they're always so hungry, and they can't send any food away. He and Mary have to eat it all. The doctor and Mrs. Medlock, they don't know what to think.
Mrs. Sowerby laughed at this funny situation. Listen, Dickon, tomorrow morning when you go there, I'll send some fresh bread and milk with you. I'll do it as often as I can. Then they won't be so hungry in the evenings, she said. They're just two growing children. They're hungry as little wolves, poor things.
You always think of a good idea, Mother,
said Dickon. Mary and Colin were very grateful the next day when Dickon brought them a bucket of fresh milk and a basket of warm bread.
Tell your mother she is a magic person, like you are,
said Colin. The food that Mary and Colin received from Mrs. Sowerby helped their play acting greatly. It was easy to eat little in the evenings when they were filled with fresh bread and cream and milk. They could easily pretend to be sickly children who had no appetite. Sometimes Colin would pretend he had a fever.
I don't understand it at all, Mrs. Medlock said to the doctor. Those terrible children are getting fatter and healthier looking every day. First, they ate like wolves. Now they won't eat anything. They just send food right back to the kitchen. How is it possible? The doctor immediately went to examine Colin.
You are looking much better,
he said to Colin.
I am sorry you are not eating. You will become thin and weak again if you don't eat. I told you it was not a natural hunger,
said Colin. He tried not to laugh.
I must write your father and tell him about this,
said the doctor.
No,
cried Colin.
I won't be written about and talked about. I am probably going to be sick again. It will only disappoint him. I feel sick now. I think I have a fever. You are making me angry, and you know that is bad for me. I hate being written about, as much as I hate being looked at." "Quiet, my boy. No letter will be sent without your permission,"
said the doctor. He said no more about it and soon left the room. When he did, Colin and Mary burst out laughing.
"I don't understand it either, Sarah,"
said the doctor to Mrs. Medlock.
"Is there any way the children can get food secretly?"
"Not unless they dig it out of the ground," said Mrs. Medlock. "Really, the change is amazing. Miss Mary used to be the ugliest, thinnest little girl. She looked like a sour old woman. Now she's pretty. Now she and Master Colin are always outside. They laugh together, just like normal children. Maybe they're getting fat on that."
"Maybe they are,"
said the doctor.
"Let them laugh."
Chapter 19. In the Garden. The summer went on. Every day the people in the secret garden became happier and healthier. The secret garden grew more beautiful every day. But far away from England, there was one person who was not happy. This man, Archibald Craven, had left Misselthwaite Manor when the air was still cold and the sky gray. He had traveled to Europe to see the mountains of Switzerland and the fields of Norway. He saw places of such beauty that any man would feel happy, but not him. For 10 years now, he had been holding a terrible sadness in his heart. He had never tried to replace any of the terrible dark thoughts with better ones. He told himself life would never get any better. However, one day he was wandering in a beautiful field in the mountains of Austria. The snow-covered mountains sparkled like diamonds. He sighed and lay down in the grass by a little stream. As he lay there, a very strange thing began to happen. The whole valley was still and quiet. The clear blue sky looked like heaven. There were little birds singing in the trees. As Archibald Craven lay there, he felt his whole soul and body becoming still and quiet too. He felt peaceful for the first time in many years. He looked at some little blue flowers in the grass. He thought to himself that they were pretty little flowers. He hadn't thought of flowers and trees and nature for many years. It was too painful and reminded him of his dead wife. But today, he found himself enjoying nature. He felt so peaceful that he soon fell asleep. He slept deeply and calmly. Soon he began to dream. He dreamed that he was surrounded by roses. He didn't know where he was. Then he heard a sweet, clear voice call, "Archie! Archie! Archie!" It was the voice of his wife.
"Lilias! Lilias!"
he cried, jumping up.
"Where are you?"
"In the garden," said the voice, laughing. "I'm in the garden." Archibald Craven woke up immediately. What had happened? He sat looking at the little stream. The dream had seemed so real.
"In the garden,"
he said out loud.
"But the garden is locked, and the key was thrown away."
He walked the many miles back to his hotel. The hotel was on the edge of a deep, clear lake. By the time he reached his room, it was night. The bright yellow moon shone among a million stars.
He was surprised to see that a letter was waiting for him. It had come from Yorkshire. He did not recognize the handwriting.
It read, "Dear Sir, I am Susan Sowerby, whose daughter, Martha, works at Misselthwaite Manor. Once I spoke to you about Miss Mary.
Now I will speak again. Please, sir, I would come home, if I were you. I think you would be happy to come, and, if you will excuse me, sir, I think your lady would ask you to come, if she were here. Yours, Susan Sowerby. Archibald Craven kept thinking about his dream. He put the letter in his pocket.
I'll return to Misselthwaite immediately,
he said. In a few days, he was in Yorkshire again. He was taking the train across the country. During this time, he found himself thinking of his son, Colin. He tried never to think about him. When he was born, his mother had died. For many months, Archibald had been almost insane with anger and sadness. The child was thin and small, and everyone said he would die. Archibald hadn't wanted to see him at all, but the child didn't die. Instead, he grew into a sickly, miserable child with a terrible temper. Thinking about Colin was unpleasant, but for the first time, his father thought to himself,
perhaps it's not too late to do something. Perhaps I can help him. What have I been thinking of?
When he reached Misselthwaite Manor, he felt something had changed about it. The dark house didn't look so dead. The late summer sunlight made the trees and gardens glow. Everything looked magical, somehow. Strangely, Archibald Craven felt glad to be home. He walked around the gardens for a while. He felt somehow afraid to pass by the secret garden, but he had a strange desire to find the door.
I will try to find the key and open the door. I don't know why. The garden has been dead for many years.
He approached the wall of the secret garden. It was covered with vines, as always. On the outside, everything looked the same as it had. But if the garden was dead, then what were the sounds he heard inside its walls? Laughter, and sounds like feet running.
Am I in a dream?
Archibald wondered.
Have I lost my mind? I must be hearing things.
Suddenly, the door to the garden flew open. A boy ran out. He didn't see Archibald standing there and almost ran into him. Archibald held his hands out just in time to prevent the boy from falling. When he looked into the boy's face, his heart began to pound. The boy was tall and handsome. His large gray eyes were shining with life. The running had given his face a healthy color. The boy brushed his thick, dark hair away from his face and stared at the man with laughing eyes. It was the boy's eyes that made Archibald gasp for breath. They were his mother's eyes.
Who? What? Who?
Archibald said. Now this was not what Colin had expected or planned. But he straightened up and said,
Father, I'm Colin. You may not believe it. I can't believe it myself. But I'm Colin.
Archibald Craven felt a great joy grow inside of him. He still could not speak.
I'm well now. The garden and Mary and Dickon made me well. We kept the secret to tell you when you came back. I can beat Mary in a race. I'm going to be an athlete.
Archibald Craven's soul was filled with joy. He put his hands on the boy's shoulders. This was the meaning of the dream. It was time for him to begin living again, as his son had.
Take me into the garden, my boy,
he said,
and tell me all about it.